Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into the ancient world, specifically into the noisy, smelly and surprisingly familiar world of Roman fast food. Imagine, if you will, the insistent clatter of sandals on uneven cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of feet and cartwheels. Hear the shouts of vendors, a cacophony of promises and prices, their voices echoing in the narrow streets. The air itself is thick, a rich tapestry woven from the aroma of roasting meat, the sweetness of baking bread, the tang of wine, all mingling with, well, let's just say less savoury smells that are an undeniable part of any ancient city. Sunlight, when it manages to pierce the narrow gaps between the tall buildings, falls in dusty shafts, illuminating a scene of perpetual motion. You're jostled, constantly, by a crowd as diverse as the empire itself. Perhaps a stern-faced senator in a surprisingly clean toga sweeping past, a group of boisterous soldiers, their armour glinting on a brief spell of leave, merchants with keen eyes and quick tongues haggling over prices, and countless slaves, their faces often etched with fatigue, scurrying on errands for their masters. Honestly, with the hygiene standards, or more accurately the distinct lack thereof, and the general, beautiful chaos of it all, if we actually zapped you back in time, you probably wouldn't survive the first week without a rather serious case of Roman tummy. Just putting that out there. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from, so drop your city and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The city of Rome presses in around you, a living, breathing entity of stone, wood, and a million souls. This isn't just any city, it's the heart of a vast empire, a place that, at its zenith, was the very first on Earth to count 1 million inhabitants within its sprawling walls. A true concrete jungle, ancient style. The sun is climbing higher, perhaps it's approaching the hour of prandium, that midday meal when the city's rhythm might shift but never truly stills. You've been on your feet for a while, perhaps exploring the monumental grandeur of the Forum, or maybe you've just arrived through one of the city gates, dusty and weary from your travels. Whatever your story, a familiar sensation begins to make itself known. A dull ache in your stomach, a growing emptiness that demands attention. It's the kind of hunger that makes the simplest fare seem like a feast, the kind that draws your senses irresistibly towards the promise of a quick, hot bite. The noise is almost a physical presence. The rumble of iron-banded wheels on stone is a constant grinding bass note, even though restrictions on wheeled traffic during daylight hours exist in some central areas. But here, on this bustling thoroughfare, or perhaps in a less regulated district, the rule feels more like a polite suggestion. Hawkers are everywhere, their voices rising in practice calls, advertising wares you can't quite yet distinguish. You hear snippets of conversations in Latin, of course, but also in Greek, and a dozen other tongues from distant corners of the empire, a testament to Rome's cosmopolitan nature. Animals add to the urban orchestra, the braying of a donkey laden with goods, the clucking of unseen chickens, the occasional bark of a dog weaving through the forest of legs. If someone tried to bottle eau de Rome, it would be a potent concoction, wouldn't it? 1 part roasting cumin, 2 parts cheap wine, a generous splash of unwashed humanity, and a lingering bass note of, well, let's call it historic drains. Your eyes try to take it all in. Towering above you on either side are the insulae, the apartment blocks of ancient Rome, rising 5, 6, sometimes even 7 stories high. Their lower floors often house shops and workshops. Their upper levels a warren of small, cramped rooms. They lean together, sometimes precariously, creating canyons of streets where the sun struggles to reach. You catch glimpses of faded paint on stuccoed walls, a shutter hanging by a single hinge, a pot of herbs bravely trying to thrive on a narrow windowsill. Every so often, a grander public building looms, its marble columns and statues a stark contrast to the everyday grit. And tucked into a seemingly random corner, you spot a small, vibrant shrine, perhaps dedicated to the Lares Compitals, the spirits of the crossroads. Offerings of flowers, a little fruit, maybe even a small piece of bread are laid out, a quiet moment of devotion amidst the secular scramble. It's a fascinating blend, this constant interplay of the sacred and the mundane, right where you're about to look for your lunch. That hunger pang returns, sharper this time. Your gaze starts to fix on the sources of those enticing smells. There, a waft of something savoury and meaty. Over there, a sweeter scent, perhaps of baking. You see makeshift stalls, some with patched awnings to ward off the sun, others just a simple wooden board laid across a couple of barrels. Small crowds are gathered around a few, patrons pointing, coins changing hands, food being passed over wrapped in leaves or perhaps on a reusable pottery shard. This is it, the ancient world's answer to convenience food. No drive-thrus here, of course. The entire city is a walk-up establishment, and you're right in the middle of the dining rush. Navigating these streets is an art form. You learn to anticipate the sudden swerve of a porter carrying a heavy amphora, to sidestep the puddle of indeterminate origin, to politely ignore the citizen loudly declaiming poetry to a largely indifferent audience. Historians still argue whether the average Roman viewed these street food experiences with a sense of daily routine, mild disgust, or simple necessity, especially given the varying sanitation which, let's be honest, likely range from questionable to actively hazardous. But when your stomach is rumbling and your purse is light, or you simply don't have the facilities to cook at home, a reality for many in those towering insulae, the allure of a hot, ready-made meal is powerful. It's the universal appeal of fast food, isn't it? Quick, accessible, and hitting just the right spot, even if you know, deep down, it might not be the pinnacle of culinary art or nutritional science. The scent of something fried and something baked is getting stronger, pulling you forward. You're ready to see what's on offer. And just as that thought solidifies, your eyes land on it. A distinct type of establishment, a beacon of hope for the hungry Roman on the go. It's a thermopolium, quite literally a place where something hot is sold. Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of a greasy spoon diner, a fast food joint, or a street-side snack bar, all rolled into one. There's no mistaking its most characteristic feature, a distinctive L-shaped counter, usually made of masonry facing directly onto the street. You see one now nestled into the ground floor of an insula, its wide opening inviting passers-by. It's bustling, but not in a chaotic way. There's a system to it, an ancient dance of commerce and consumption. You approach, weaving through a couple of patrons who are already eating, leaning against the wall or perched on the edge of the curb. The counter itself is often decorated, perhaps with painted panels depicting food items, lucky symbols, or even scenes from mythology, a sort of ancient menu board and marketing campaign combined. You might even spot a depiction of Mercury, the god of commerce, and rather cheekily of thieves, perhaps a subtle warning to pay your tab. Embedded into the top of this counter are several large earthenware jars known as doughnuts. These are the heart of the operation, sunk deep into the masonry to keep their contents either hot or in some cases cool. The steam rising from a couple of them is a welcome sight, carrying with it a medley of savoury aromas that make your stomach rumble with renewed vigour. It's a far cry from a gleaming stainless steel kitchen, that's for sure. You can just imagine the Roman equivalent of a health inspector having a field day here. Sir, is that garum sitting next to the... Is that a sleeping cat? These thermopolia were incredibly common, especially in densely populated urban areas like Rome, Ostia, and famously Pompeii. In Pompeii alone, archaeologists have uncovered over 80 such establishments, many remarkably well preserved by the volcanic ash, giving us a fantastic snapshot of daily Roman life. Some are simple, utilitarian affairs, while others are more elaborately decorated, perhaps hinting at a slightly more discerning clientele, or at least an owner with a bit more capital to invest. You can see the ware on the stone counter in front of you, smoothed and grooved by countless hands and spilled drinks over many years. It's a tangible link to the past, this simple food counter. The proprietor, perhaps a stout fellow with a surprisingly clean apron, or maybe not so clean, let's be realistic, beams at you, or at least gives you a nod that acknowledges your presence as a potential customer. He might be the owner, or a trusted slave managing the day-to-day business. Behind him, in the small, often dark space that serves as the kitchen and storage area, you might catch a glimpse of a crackling fire, or hear the clatter of pots. There isn't much seating, if any. Most thermopolia were designed for quick service and consumption on the go. Patrons would stand at the counter or take their purchases away, perhaps to eat in a nearby square or back in their cramped lodgings. Some larger establishments might have had a small back room with a few tables and benches, but the street front counter was the main point of interaction. Your gaze drifts along the counter, past the steaming dolia, to the other offerings arrayed for the hungry Roman. This isn't a place for delicate sensibilities or picky eaters. This is fuel, plain and simple, designed to be consumed quickly and get you back to your day, whether that involves hauling amphorae at the docks or meticulously copying scrolls in a dusty scriptorium. The menu, such as it is laid out before you, a very tangible display of what's available. One of the most common sights, and smells, would be various forms of sausage. Romans, like many cultures throughout history, were masters of using every part of the animal, and sausage making is a prime example of this thrifty ingenuity. You see links of lucanica, a smoky, spicy pork sausage that was apparently a favourite of Roman soldiers, and it's said to have been introduced to Rome by soldiers returning from Lucania in southern Italy. The name itself, lucanica, has even been suggested by some linguists as a possible ancestor of Italy's luganega, or Spain's longaniza. These sausages might be sizzling on a small grill set up nearby, or perhaps they're kept warm in a covered dish. The aroma is rich and enticing, a promise of fat and flavour. They'd likely be made with a variety of fillings, pork, certainly, but also perhaps game, or cheaper cuts mixed with breadcrumbs and spices to stretch the meat further. You wouldn't necessarily ask for an ingredients list. It's probably better not to know sometimes. Just point, pay and enjoy the greasy goodness. Next to the sausages, you might spot small skewered pieces of meat, brochettes of a sort. These could be chicken, if you were lucky, or perhaps more common, bits of goat or mutton. Sometimes more exotic, or just cheaper, options might appear, like dormice, which were considered a delicacy by some, though perhaps less common as street food and more of a specialty item for those with peculiar tastes or deeper pockets. These grilled morsels would be seasoned simply, perhaps with salt, pepper and a sprinkle of herbs, and cooked over a charcoal brazier, adding a smoky char to the flavour. One can imagine the sizzle and spit as they cooked, another layer in the rich soundscape of the Roman street. Then there's the bread. Bread was the absolute staff of life in Rome, a cornerstone of the diet for rich and poor alike. But the bread you'd find at a thermopolium wouldn't be the fancy, fine-milled stuff of the elite. This would be panis plebeius, common bread, or panis rusticus, coarser, often made with whole grains like emmer wheat or barley, sometimes with a bit of millet or even ground beans mixed in if grain was expensive. It would be dense, perhaps a little gritty, and probably slightly sour from the leavening agents. You might see small round loaves, or flatbreads, easy to tear and use for scooping up stew or mopping up sauces. These flatbreads, sometimes called placenta, though this term more famously refers to a layered cheesecake-like dish, could also serve as an edible plate or wrapper for other foods. Think of, you peer into the dolia. One seems to hold a thick, bubbling stew, chunks of unidentifiable meat or vegetables swimming in a rich-looking broth. Another might contain lentils or beans, a staple for the common Roman. Yet another could be filled with hot water, perhaps for diluting wine or for some rudimentary cleaning. The smells are strong, earthy, and not altogether unpleasant, though perhaps a little intense for a modern nose accustomed to more subtle seasonings. Remember, refrigeration is a distant dream, so dishes are cooked to be eaten quickly, or are heavily preserved with salt, vinegar, or those ever-present strong sauces. There's a certain rustic charm to it, assuming you don't think too hard about the fly that just landed perilously close to the ladle. Adds flavour, the vendor might quip if he's feeling jovial. One of the more curious aspects of some thermopolia, especially those found in Pompeii, is the presence of a lararium, or household shrine, often built right into the back wall or even incorporated into the counter design. These shrines were dedicated to the Lars, household gods, the Penates, gods of the storeroom, very appropriate for a food vendor, and often to Mercury, as mentioned, or Bacchus, the god of wine. It's a reminder that even in the most commercial of settings, Roman life was interwoven with religious observance. Perhaps offering a quick prayer before ladling out the stew was thought to bring good business or ward off spoilage, a divine insurance policy, if you will. Historians still debate the precise social standing of thermopolium owners and their clientele, ranging from lowly freedmen working hard to make a living, to more established entrepreneurs who might own several such establishments. It's likely there was a spectrum just as there is with takeaway owners today. You wonder what exactly is in that stew. It smells gamey. Could it be boar? Or perhaps something more humble, like goat? It's hard to tell. The Romans weren't particularly squeamish about what parts of the animal they ate, so nose-to-tail eating was less a trendy culinary movement and more a daily necessity. You might also see simpler fare on offer: hard-boiled eggs, olives, coarse bread, and various types of cheese. The options are geared towards being filling, cheap, and easy to handle without elaborate cutlery. Think less Michelin star, more filling a hole. And honestly, after a long morning of tramping around the Forum, filling a hole sounds pretty good. These places weren't just about food though, they were also social hubs, albeit often of a lower class variety. Here, people could catch up on the latest gossip, grumble about taxes or the price of grain, or perhaps place a small bet on the upcoming chariot races. The chatter of other customers provides a constant background hum. You hear a couple of legionaries arguing good-naturedly over who owes whom a drink, a woman haggling over the price of a piece of cheese, and the vendor calling out to a regular. It's a slice of life, unvarnished and authentic. You could probably learn more about the real concerns of the average Roman by listening in at a thermopolism for an hour than by reading a dozen senatorial decrees, though you might also pick up a few choice Latin curse words, useful for later perhaps, if a chariot cuts you off. The sheer number of these establishments speaks volumes about Roman urban life. With many apartment dwellers in the insulae lacking proper kitchens or even safe hearths, eating out wasn't a luxury. It was often a necessity. The thermopolium filled this vital niche, providing hot, prepared food for a large segment of the population. It was the engine that fueled the working class of Rome, one hot ladleful at a time. You're now convinced this is where you'll get your midday meal. The question is, what to choose from the steaming depths of those ancient crock-pots? Now as you take your first bite of that smoky sausage, its savoury juices mingling with the slightly sour taste of the dense bread, you become aware of a background flavour, a certain umami richness that seems to permeate almost everything edible in this Roman world. It's a deep, salty, slightly funky tang that, once you notice it, you realise is present in the aroma of the bubbling stews in the dolia, probably in the marinade for those grilled meat skewers, and almost certainly in any accompanying sauces. This, my friend, is the infamous, the ubiquitous, the utterly Roman flavour enhancer, garum. Garum, or its thinner cousin, liquamen, was more than just a condiment. It was a fundamental element of Roman cuisine, used much like soy sauce is in many Asian cuisines today, or perhaps like Worcestershire sauce in the West, but with an intensity all its own. You've heard tales of it, perhaps whispered with a mixture of fascination and disgust, because the basic recipe sounds, well, challenging to a modern palate. At its core, garum was a fermented fish sauce, and when I say fish, I mean all of the fish. Guts, blood, heads, tails, the whole shebang. Small fish like anchovies, sprats, or sardines were commonly used, layered with salt in large vats or clay amphorae, often in a ratio of about 2 parts fish to 1 part salt, though recipes varied. These vats were then left out in the Mediterranean sun for several weeks, sometimes months. During this time, a natural enzymatic process, autolysis, would break down the fish tissues. The salt prevented putrefaction by harmful bacteria, allowing the desired fermentation to occur. The result was a clear amber-coloured liquid, the garum itself, which was carefully drained off. The remaining fish solids, a paste called alec or halec, was also used, typically as a more common, cheaper flavouring for the lower classes, or as an additive to animal feed. It's fascinating that something made from what sounds like organic waste became such a prized commodity. Think of it as ancient umami gold. You can imagine the smell around a garum factory. It must have been memorable. In fact, Pliny the Elder, the famous Roman naturalist and writer, described garum as a choice liquor, but also noted that the production facilities were often located outside of city limits due to the powerful odour. That's a pretty polite way of saying it stank to high heaven. Yet, the finished product, when made well, was said to have a complex savoury flavour that added depth and savouriness to dishes without necessarily tasting overtly fishy if used correctly. It was all about that umami kick, that satisfying richness that makes food taste more food-like, an ancient pita or naan, versatile and practical. You can picture a worker grabbing a chunk of this hearty bread and a link of sausage, a quick and filling meal that could be eaten while walking. Olives, of course, would be ubiquitous. Preserved in brine, they were a cheap and readily available source of calories and flavour. You'd see them in various shades, green, black, purple, glistening in their salty liquid, perhaps seasoned with a little vinegar or herbs. A handful of olives and a piece of bread could constitute a meal in itself for someone in a hurry or on a tight budget. Cheese, too, would be on offer. Not the aged complex cheeses savoured by connoisseurs, but more likely fresh, simple sheep's or goat's cheese, perhaps salty and crumbly, or a harder, more travel-worthy variety. It would be sold by the chunk cut from a larger wheel or block. One popular type was Caseus aridus, a hard, dry cheese that kept well, making it suitable for travellers and soldiers, and likely for street vendors too. You might also encounter something akin to ancient pasties or savoury pies, small enclosed pastries filled with minced meat, vegetables, or perhaps cheese and herbs. These would be easy to hold and eat without utensils, a perfect example of Roman convenience food. The pastry itself would likely be simple, made with flour and water, perhaps a little lard or olive oil for richness, and baked until golden. Historians still argue whether these little pies were more common in urban centres, or if they were a widespread snack throughout the empire, but their practicality for on-the-go eating is undeniable. Imagine breaking through the crisp crust to a warm, savoury filling, a comforting bite in the midst of a busy day. Vegetables would also feature, though perhaps not in the fresh, crisp salad form we might expect. More likely they'd be cooked. Stewed lentils, chickpeas or fava beans were common and nutritious. You might see roasted root vegetables, like turnips or parsnips when in season. Leafy greens, if available, might be cooked down with a little oil and garlic. Raw vegetables were sometimes viewed with suspicion, potentially carrying miasmas or being harder to digest, especially for the urban populace whose water sources could be iffy. So, cooked was generally considered safer and more wholesome. One quirky tidbit is that Romans were apparently quite fond of mallow, a common plant often considered a weed today, which they would cook and eat as a vegetable. Perhaps the vendor has a pot of stewed mallow leaves, an acquired taste no doubt. And for those looking for something a little different, how about some fried fish? Near coastal cities, or places with good river access, small, whole fried fish could be a popular street snack. Crispy, salty, and eaten bones and all, or perhaps salted fish, rehydrated and cooked into a stew. Given Rome's proximity to the Tiber and its port at Ostia, fresh and preserved seafood would have definitely made its way to the street food stalls. You can almost smell the faint, fishy aroma mingling with the other scents. All these items would be served with minimal fuss. No fancy plating here. Food might be handed to you on a large leaf, a piece of flatbread, or perhaps a simple reusable pottery shard that you'd hopefully return, or that would be washed, one presumes, in a somewhat cursory fashion. Cutlery? Probably not. This is finger food, meant to be eaten with your hands. Napkins? A piece of bread would do, or you could just wipe your hands on your tunic, as many probably did. It's a beautifully unpretentious way of eating, focused entirely on the practicalities of getting food into your belly. You select a hearty-looking sausage and a chunk of dark bread. The vendor, with practiced speed, plucks them from their respective spots, perhaps wrapping the sausage in a fig leaf. A few arses, small copper coins, change hands, and your Roman lunch is served. Not bad for a quick bite on the ancient streets. Having satisfied your savoury cravings with that garum-tinged sausage and hearty bread, your attention might now be drawn to another set of vendors, those catering to a different, but equally powerful human desire, the sweet tooth. While Roman cuisine is often associated with those robust, salty and fermented flavours, they certainly didn't shy away from sweetness. Sugar as we know it, derived from sugarcane or beets, wasn't available to the Romans. Their primary sweetener, and a hugely important commodity, was honey. And you can be sure that honey in various delightful forms made its way onto the street food scene. Imagine a stall, perhaps a little less smoky and a bit more fragrant than the sausage grill, where a vendor presides over an array of tempting treats. The most common and accessible would be simple honey cakes, or melke. These could range from small, dense, cookie-like bites to slightly larger, softer cakes, all sweetened liberally with honey. The flour used might be wheat, or perhaps barley for a cheaper version, and they could be flavoured with additions like poppy seeds, sesame seeds, nuts, if the vendor was feeling generous, or even a pinch of spice like anise or cumin. The Romans had a penchant for blurring the lines between sweet and savoury. These cakes would be baked, perhaps in a small portable oven or on a griddle, and their warm, sweet scent would be a powerful lure. You can picture children, their faces sticky, clamouring for one, or a weary worker treating themselves to a small moment of sugary pleasure. Fruit, of course, was a natural source of sweetness, and vendors would sell fresh seasonal fruits when available. Figs, grapes, apples, pears and plums would all have been familiar sights. But to make them more interesting, or to preserve them, Romans also excelled at making fruit conserves. You might see a vendor with pots of what we would recognise as jams or fruit pastes, made by slowly cooking down fruits with honey until they were thick and intensely sweet. These could be eaten on their own, spread on a piece of bread, a sweet counterpart to the savoury snacks, or used as a filling for pastries. Imagine a dollop of rich fig and honey conserve, delicious, sticky and utterly Roman. Then there were the dulcia, a general term for sweets or desserts. This category could include more elaborate confections, though the truly fancy pastries were more likely found in bake shops, bistrini, or the kitchens of the wealthy. However, street vendors could offer simpler versions. One popular treat, especially during festivals, was globulum, which were essentially little fried dough balls, somewhat akin to modern doughnuts or fritters. These would be made from a simple flour and water dough, perhaps with a bit of cheese mixed in. Again, that sweet savoury blend. Fried until golden, and then drizzled generously with honey, and sometimes sprinkled with poppy seeds. The thought of hot, crispy globuli dripping with warm honey is enough to make your mouth water even now, 2 millennia later. It's a mainstream. There were different grades and varieties of garum. The most prized, garum sociorum, came from Cartagena in Hispania, modern-day Spain, and was made from mackerel. It was incredibly expensive, a luxury item for the wealthy elite, fetching prices comparable to fine perfumes. But cheaper versions were widely available and used by all social classes. You could get garum flavoured with herbs, spices, or even diluted with wine or vinegar to create different sauces like garum, wine garum, or oxygarum, vinegar garum. The thermopolium, where you just bought your lunch, would almost certainly be using a more everyday grade of liquamen, or a generic garum, but its presence is undeniable. It's in the sheen of the stew, the savour of the sausage. Historians still argue whether the truly high-end garum was as pungent as its production method suggests, or if the best varieties achieved a more refined, subtle flavour profile. Some ancient writers rhapsodised about its qualities, while others seemed to find it a bit much. Apicius, the famous Roman gourmand whose cookbook, or at least a collection attributed to him, survives, uses garum or liquamen in nearly every savoury recipe, from roasted meats to vegetable dishes, and even in some surprisingly sweet and savoury concoctions. It was the Roman MSG, their secret weapon for making bland ingredients more palatable. The production of garum was a major industry across the Roman Empire, particularly in coastal regions of Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and around the Black Sea. Large-scale factories with rows of salting vats have been excavated, and the distinctive amphorae used to transport garum are found in archaeological sites all over the Roman world, from Britain to Syria. These amphorae often bore painted labels, or tituli picti, indicating the type of garum, its producer, and its origin, a testament to a sophisticated trade network. It's a mainstream historical fact that the economy of entire coastal towns could revolve around the production and export of this pungent elixir. One quirky tidbit related to garum is its supposed medicinal uses. Pliny the Elder, alongside praising its culinary virtues, also claimed it could cure dysentery, treat dog bites, and even alleviate chronic earaches. While we might raise a sceptical eyebrow at these claims today, it shows how deeply ingrained garum was in Roman life, seen not just as food, but as something with broader properties. Perhaps the high salt content had some antiseptic qualities, or maybe it was just a case of, if it tastes that strong, it must be doing something good. You wouldn't want to try the earache remedy though, I suspect. A fish sauce eardrop sounds like a recipe for a very unhappy ear canal. As you chew your Roman lunch, you try to isolate that garum flavour. It's not overtly fishy in the way that, say, an anchovy paste might be if you ate it straight. Instead, it's a background hum of saltiness and a deep, almost meaty savouriness. It enhances the flavour of the pork in the sausage, gives an extra dimension to the bread if you were to dip it into a stew. It's easy to see how, in a world without readily available refrigeration, and with often monotonous staple foods like grain and pulses, a powerful flavouring like garum would become indispensable. It could transform simple ingredients mask less than fresh flavours, and add a touch of luxury, or at least a familiar taste, to meals eaten far from home. So, as you finish your street food snack, remember that almost invisible but ever-present ingredient, the lifeblood of Roman flavour, swimming silently in nearly every savoury dish. It's a taste of the sea, fermented by the sun and carried across an empire. Having indulged in a sweet treat, perhaps a sticky honey cake or some crunchy honey-glazed nuts, your throat might be feeling a little dry. The Roman sun, even filtered through the narrow streets, can be surprisingly warm, and all that walking and sensory overload certainly builds a thirst. Your gaze now naturally shifts to find something to drink. Fortunately, just as with food, Roman street vendors were ready to quench the thirst of the bustling populace, though your options might be a little different from what you'd find in a modern vending machine. The undisputed king of Roman beverages, consumed by nearly everyone from the emperor down to the humblest labourer, was wine. But we're not necessarily talking about the fine Falernian or Kecuban vintages that poets praised and senators sipped at lavish banquets. What you'd find on the street, readily available and cheap, would be vinum amirum, unmixed wine, but more commonly, wine heavily diluted with water. Drinking wine undiluted was often considered a barbaric practice by the Romans. Civilized people mixed it, usually with at least 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine, sometimes even more. This not only stretched the wine further, making it more economical, but also made it less intoxicating, more suitable for everyday drinking throughout the day. You'd see vendors ladling this watered-down wine from large amphorae or skin bags into simple pottery cups. The wine itself would vary in quality. Cheaper wines were often harsh, acidic, and prone to spoiling quickly. To make them more palatable, or to mask off flavours, they might be flavoured with spices, herbs, honey, mulsum, a popular honeyed wine, or even seawater, a surprisingly common practice in some coastal regions, believed to aid preservation and add a certain tang. The colour could range from a pale rosé-like hue to a darker red, depending on the grapes and production methods. Don't expect an oaky Chardonnay or a complex Cabernet Sauvignon. This is functional hydration with a bit of a kick. You'd hand over a small coin, receive your cup of cool, or more likely ambient temperature diluted wine, and find a spot to sip it. It's a mainstream historical fact that wine was considered safer to drink than plain water in many urban areas, as the alcohol content, even when diluted, helped to kill some of the bacteria that might be lurking in questionable water sources. If plain watered wine wasn't to your taste, or if you were a soldier, a labourer, or someone engaging in strenuous activity, you might opt for posce. Posca was a very common drink in ancient Rome, especially among the military and the lower classes. It was essentially a sour wine or vinegar mixed with water, and sometimes herbs for flavouring. While it might sound unappetising to us, vinegar water, it was actually a practical and refreshing drink. The acidity made it thirst-quenching. It was cheap to produce, often made from wine that had gone off, and historical fact that these globuli are described by Cato the Elder in his work De Agricultura, making them one of the oldest recorded recipes for a sweet treat. Nuts coated in honey were another simple but popular street snack. Almonds, walnuts, or hazelnuts, toasted and then enrobed in a crackling layer of hardened honey, would provide a satisfying crunch and a burst of sweetness. These would be easy to sell in small portions, perhaps in a paper cone, or its ancient equivalent, a twist of leaf or parchment. Think of them as the Roman version of candied nuts you might find at a modern fairground. One quirky or fringe tidbit related to Roman sweets is the use of defrutum or sapa. These were grape must, unfermented grape juice, that had been boiled down to reduce its volume and concentrate its sweetness. Defrutum was reduced by about half, and sapa by up to 2/3, resulting in a thick, syrupy liquid. While primarily used in winemaking and as a general sweetener in cooking, it could also be used to create sweet treats, glaze fruits, or even be drizzled over snow fetched from the mountains in winter for a sort of ancient slushy or granita, a luxury for sure. But the idea of a Roman snow cone sweetened with grape syrup is rather delightful. Historians still argue whether lead poisoning from defrutum, which was sometimes boiled in lead pots, a practice that could leach lead into the syrup, was a significant contributing factor to the decline of the Roman Empire. While lead was certainly present and harmful, the decline by defrutum theory is generally considered an oversimplification today, though it highlights the potential hidden dangers in ancient food preparation. You might also see vendors selling dried fruits, which were an important way of preserving the harvest and ensuring a supply of sweetness throughout the year. Figs, dates, imported from warmer climes, and raisins would be common. These could be eaten as is, or incorporated into cakes and pastries. A handful of dates, with their intense caramel-like sweetness, would be a quick energy boost. For something a bit more substantial, you might find civilum, a baked cheesecake-like dish. While a grand civilum might be served at a banquet, simpler, smaller versions could conceivably have been sold by street vendors. It was typically made with cheese, like ricotta, flour, eggs and honey, and baked until set. The Roman writer Cato also provides a recipe for this, indicating its long history. It's interesting to consider the Roman palate for sweetness. Without refined sugar, their sweets would have had a different character, perhaps less intensely sweet in a one-dimensional way, and more complex due to the flavours of honey, which varied depending on the flowers the bees visited, and the fruits themselves. The frequent combination of sweet with savoury or cheesy elements also points to a different set of taste preferences than many of us are used to today. You wouldn't likely find a Roman complaining that their dessert wasn't sweet enough. The honey and fruit syrups provided ample sweetness, but it was often balanced by other flavours. So, as you scan the offerings of the sweet seller, maybe a small honey cake catches your eye, or perhaps a few honey-glazed nuts. It's a reminder that the Romans, for all their military might and engineering prowess, also appreciated the simple pleasures of life, like a sweet bite to brighten the day. You could imagine a Roman, after a tough morning's work, feeling that same pull we do towards something sugary, a little reward, a moment of indulgence amidst the hustle and bustle of the ancient city. That warm, comforting scent of baked goods and honey is a timeless invitation. Having quenched your thirst, perhaps with that somewhat rustic, watered-down wine, your mind might idly wander to a very practical consideration, one that would have been a constant, pressing reality for every Roman vendor and household. Food spoilage. In a world utterly devoid of refrigeration, freezers, or even reliable ice, unless you were fabulously wealthy and lived near a mountain range where snow could be harvested and rushed to you in insulated chests, a rare luxury indeed, keeping food fresh, especially in the warm Mediterranean climate, was a daily, relentless battle. The street food vendors you've been observing wouldn't have a walk-in cooler or a fridge under the counter. They were engaged in a constant race against decay. Think about the items on offer, the sausages, the stews, the cheese, the cooked vegetables. How did they prevent these from becoming a health hazard within hours, or even minutes, under the Roman sun? The answer lies in a combination of clever preservation techniques, rapid turnover, and, let's be frank, a higher tolerance for foods that were on the turn. What we might consider spoiled, a Roman might have considered perfectly edible, perhaps with the judicious application of a strong sauce. Hello again, garum, to mask any off flavours. Salt was, of course, the primary weapon in the fight against spoilage. Salting meat and fish was an ancient practice, essential for preserving these protein sources for more than a day or two. The sausages you saw were likely heavily salted, both as a flavouring and a preservative. Fish, as we discussed with garum, was often either fermented with salt or simply salt cured and dried. Large quantities of salt were produced and traded throughout the empire. It was a vital strategic resource, not just a seasoning. You might see whole salted fish hanging at a stall, or chunks of salt-cured meat that would be soaked to rehydrate it before cooking. Drying was another key method. Fruits like figs, grapes, to make raisins, and apricots were laid out in the sun to desiccate, concentrating their sugars and removing the moisture that bacteria and moulds need to thrive. Vegetables could also be dried. Strips of meat could be sun-dried or smoke-dried to create a kind of jerky, a long-lasting and portable food source, perfect for travellers and soldiers, and likely available from some street vendors as a quick, chewy snack. Smoking, as mentioned with lucanica sausages, not only added flavour but also had a preservative effect due to the antibacterial compounds in wood smoke. Smokehouses, or even... As you ponder the Romans' relentless battle against food spoilage, another thought naturally follows. Why were so many people eating out on the streets in the first place? Surely a home-cooked meal would be preferable, safer, and perhaps even cheaper. The answer for a vast number of Rome's inhabitants lies in the very structure of their homes, or lack thereof when it came to cooking facilities. You glance up at the towering apartment blocks, the insulae that line the street, rising story upon story crammed with humanity. These weren't spacious suburban houses with well-equipped kitchens. The vast majority of Rome's population, perhaps up to 90%, lived in these insulae. While the ground floors often housed shops, workshops, or the more spacious dwellings of the relatively well-off, the upper floors were a different world. Here, rooms were small, often single spaces where a whole family might live, eat, and sleep. Proper kitchens, as we would understand them, were a rarity in these cramped quarters. Imagine your tiny one-room apartment, 5 flights up a rickety wooden staircase. Where would you safely build a fire for cooking? Open fires were an enormous hazard in these densely packed, often poorly constructed buildings, many of which incorporated a lot of timber in their upper structures. Fires were a constant dread in Rome, capable of spreading with terrifying speed and devastating large swathes of the city. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, during Nero's reign, is the most famous example, but smaller fires were a regular occurrence. Consequently, restrictions on open fires in insulae were common, and even where not explicitly forbidden, the practicalities and dangers would have discouraged most tenants from anything more ambitious than perhaps a small portable brazier used with extreme caution. You can just picture the ancient equivalent of a smoke alarm going off, probably just a neighbour screaming "fire" and everyone scrambling for their lives. Not exactly conducive to a relaxing evening of culinary experimentation. Like diluted wine, the vinegar likely had some antibacterial properties. Roman soldiers were regularly supplied with posca as part of their rations, and it's mentioned numerous times in historical texts. It was considered a healthy, invigorating drink. You can imagine a construction worker on a hot day gratefully gulping down a cup of posca provided by a street vendor. What about water itself? While Rome was famous for its aqueducts, which brought vast quantities of fresh water into the city, accessing clean drinking water directly from a public fountain was the ideal. However, not everyone lived conveniently close to a pristine fountain, and the quality of water from some sources or from cisterns in insulums could be dubious. Street vendors might sell water, perhaps claiming it was from a particularly good spring, but you'd have to take their word for it. It would likely be sold from large jars, and its coolness would depend entirely on how long it had been sitting out, or if the vendor had a shady spot. Beer, cervisia, or zithum, was known to the Romans, particularly from the northern provinces like Gaul and Britannia, where it was a staple, but it wasn't nearly as popular in Rome itself, or in the Mediterranean heartland of the empire. It was generally considered a somewhat barbaric drink, less sophisticated than wine. While you might occasionally find a vendor selling beer, especially if catering to soldiers or immigrants from beer-drinking regions, it wouldn't be a common sight in most Roman thermopolia or street stalls. Wine was king. Milk, primarily from goats or sheep, was also consumed, but it was often viewed with some suspicion by adults, particularly in its fresh state. It was considered by some physicians to be difficult to digest for adults. Perhaps many Romans were unknowingly lactose intolerant. Cheese and yogurt, being fermented, were more widely accepted. Children, however, did drink milk. It's unlikely you'd find a vendor selling chilled glasses of fresh milk like a modern dairy bar, but you might find it as an ingredient or perhaps being sold for household use. One quirky tidbit regarding Roman drinks is the existence of various fruit juices or squashes, though perhaps not in the commercially bottled way we think of them. Juices from pomegranates, lemons, though less common and more of a luxury, or other fruits could be mixed with water and sweetened with honey to create refreshing beverages, especially in warmer weather. There are also references to drinks made from fermented grains other than barley, or from certain berries. The Romans were quite experimental when it came to fermenting things. Historians still argue about the exact social connotations of drinking posca versus cheap wine. Was posca exclusively a lower class or soldier's drink, or did its reputation for health benefits give it a wider, if still humble, appeal? It certainly appears more frequently in contexts associated with labour and military life. The Gospels in the New Testament mention Roman soldiers offering Jesus posca, translated as sour wine or vinegar, on the cross, a detail that reflects its common use among soldiers. So, as you stand there considering your options, the most likely choice is a cup of watered-down wine. The vendor ladles it out, the earthenware cup cool in your hand. It's not a fine vintage, certainly, perhaps a little rough around the edges, with a slightly resinous or overly tart note, but it's wet, it's relatively cheap, and it's deeply, authentically Roman. You take a sip. It's an experience. It cuts through the dryness in your throat and washes down the lingering sweetness of your earlier treat. It's the taste of the Roman street, simple and unadorned. Around you, others are doing the same. A craftsman taking a break, a couple of friends sharing a jug, a traveller refreshing himself after a long journey. It's a shared moment, a simple ritual of hydration in the heart of the ancient metropolis. And as the liquid soothes your thirst, you're ready to continue your exploration, perhaps with a slightly more Roman perspective on the world. Now that you understand why so many Romans frequented these ancient fast food establishments, you might be wondering about the establishments themselves. What was their reputation? Were thermopolia and street food stalls seen as respectable businesses, or did they occupy a shadier, less savoury corner of Roman society? The answer, as with many things in history, is a bit complicated and likely depended on who you asked. For the common Roman, the plebs urbanus who relied on these places for their daily sustenance, the thermopolium was probably viewed with a mixture of practicality and, perhaps, a certain fondness. It was a place to get a hot meal quickly and cheaply, a place to meet friends, to catch up on news and gossip, a familiar part of the daily routine. The quality of food might vary, the hygiene might be questionable, but it served a vital need. You can imagine a stonemason covered in dust after a long day's work, looking forward to a cup of wine and a bowl of hot stew at his local thermopolium, a small comfort and a chance to unwind. For him, the reputation was probably good enough. However, if you were to ask a member of the Roman elite, a senator, a wealthy landowner, or a moralizing philosopher, you might get a very different, and often quite negative picture. Many upper-class Romans viewed these establishments with suspicion, even disdain. They were often seen as hangouts for the lower classes, places of idleness, drunkenness, gambling, and other unsavoury activities. Think of the way some people today might talk about seedy bars or down-market fast food joints. There's a similar vein of social snobbery and moral disapproval in some ancient Roman writings. The poet Horace, for example, sometimes wrote dismissively of the cheap food and wine found in such places, contrasting it with the refined pleasures of an elite dinner party. Juvenal, the master satirist, often painted a grim picture of the Roman underbelly, and while he didn't always, simple smoking arrangements over a fire would have been used to extend the shelf life of meats and cheeses. Pickling, using vinegar or brine, was widely employed for vegetables. Olives, a staple, were almost always preserved in brine. Cucumbers, onions, cabbages, and other vegetables could be pickled, providing a source of tart, crunchy accompaniments to meals throughout the year. The acidity of the vinegar created an inhospitable environment for many spoilage organisms. Remember that posca we talked about? The vinegar in it wasn't just for flavour. Honey, with its high sugar concentration and natural antimicrobial properties, was an excellent preservative for fruits. Fruits cooked down with honey into thick conserves or jams, as we saw at the sweet stalls, could last for a considerable time if stored properly in sealed jars. This was a common way to enjoy the taste of summer fruits in the depths of winter. Fermentation, as seen with garum and wine, was another powerful preservation technique. The process not only transformed the food, but also created byproducts like alcohol or lactic acid that inhibited the growth of undesirable microbes. Cheese and yogurt are other examples of milk preserved through controlled fermentation. Beyond these active preservation methods, vendors relied on a few other strategies. One was simply to cook food thoroughly and serve it hot. The heat would kill many surface bacteria, and as long as the food was consumed relatively quickly, it would be reasonably safe. Those bubbling stews in the dolia at the thermopolium were kept hot for this very reason. It's a mainstream historical fact that many Roman recipes, especially for stews and braised dishes, involved long cooking times, which would have helped to tenderize tougher cuts of meat, and also ensure the food was well heated. Another strategy was rapid turnover. Vendors aimed to sell out their stock each day. They would prepare only what they thought they could sell, minimizing leftovers. This is where intimate knowledge of their neighborhood and customer habits came in handy. If they did have leftovers, they might be repurposed, yesterday's stew becoming an ingredient in today's meat pie, perhaps. Or, less appealingly, they might be sold off very cheaply at the end of the day to those who were less particular or more desperate. One quirky tidbit related to Roman food preservation involves the use of certain spices and herbs that were believed to have preservative qualities beyond just their flavour. Things like rosemary, thyme, and oregano contain natural antimicrobial compounds. While the Romans wouldn't have understood the science behind it, they would have observed empirically that foods seasoned with certain herbs seem to last longer, or taste better for longer. So the heavy use of herbs in Roman cooking wasn't just for taste, it was part of their arsenal against spoilage. Historians still argue about the true extent of foodborne illness in ancient Rome. Given the lack of refrigeration, the often questionable water sources, and the general hygiene standards, it seems almost inevitable that Roman tummy, dysentery, food poisoning, and parasitic infections must have been incredibly common. Ancient medical texts certainly describe plenty of digestive ailments, yet the population of Rome grew and for a time thrived. This suggests that their methods of food handling and preservation, while rudimentary by our standards, were effective enough to sustain a large urban population, or that people simply developed stronger stomachs, or sadly, a higher mortality rate from such illnesses. You look at the food on display now with a new appreciation. It's not just a collection of snacks, it's a testament to human ingenuity in the face of a constant natural challenge. Every salted olive, every dried fig, every link of smoky sausage represents a small victory against the forces of decay. The vendor, wiping his hands on his apron, isn't just a cook. He's a daily warrior in the battle for freshness, or at least for edibility. And you, the consumer, are placing your trust in his skills and his judgment. It adds a little frisson of risk to your Roman lunch, doesn't it? A reminder that survival, even in the heart of a great empire, depended on such fundamental everyday struggles. Even if you had a safe way to use a brazier, what about fuel? Wood and charcoal were commodities that had to be bought and hauled up those narrow stairs. Then there's the smoke and fumes to contend with in a poorly ventilated space. And water? While aqueducts brought water to public fountains, not every insula had running water piped to the upper floors. Carrying water for cooking and cleaning up several flights of stairs would have been another daily chore. Storage space for food, utensils, and fuel would also have been severely limited. It's a mainstream historical fact that the living conditions in many insulas were crowded and basic, offering little more than shelter. So, for many, many Romans, the artisans, the labourers, the shop assistants, the clerks, the myriad of people who made the city function, cooking at home was simply not a practical or appealing option. It was easier, safer, and often not much more expensive to grab a hot meal from a thermopolium or a snack from a street vendor. These establishments effectively served as the communal kitchens for a large part of the city's population. They had the space, the equipment, and the expertise to produce food in bulk, something an individual living in a tiny cubiculum room could not easily replicate. Think about your own life. If your apartment had no kitchen, no stove, no fridge, and using a camping stove indoors was a fire hazard, wouldn't you be eating out or getting takeaway most of the time? That was the reality for a significant portion of Roman urbanites. The thermopolium wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity, an integral part of the urban infrastructure that allowed so many people to live and work in such close proximity. Of course, the wealthy had a very different experience. If you were a rich senator or a prosperous merchant living in a domus, a private single-family house, or a spacious ground-floor apartment in a better insula, you would have a dedicated kitchen, culina. These kitchens, while still basic by modern standards, often small, smoky, and tucked away at the back of the house, would have a proper hearth or oven, storage space for food and equipment, and slave cooks to do the actual work. The elite could enjoy elaborate multi-course meals prepared in their own homes, but this was a world away from the experience of the average plebeian. One quirky tidbit about insular living is the anecdotally reported danger of falling objects. Not just from collapsing buildings, which did happen, but things being thrown or dropped from upper windows. Wastewater, rubbish, you name it. The satirist Juvenal famously wrote about the risks of walking Roman streets at night, including the contents of chamber pots being emptied from above. While this is often quoted with a grimace, it underscores the crowded and sometimes unsanitary conditions. Trying to cook in such an environment, with minimal sanitation for food prep and waste disposal within your tiny room, adds another layer of unappealing difficulty. Who wants to chop vegetables next to their bedpan? Historians still debate the exact percentage of Romans who relied primarily on street food versus those who did some form of cooking in their insulae, perhaps using portable braziers for simple reheating or one-pot meals. It likely varied depending on the specific insulae, the tenant's economic status, and individual circumstances. Some insulae might have had communal cooking areas, though evidence for this is sparse. It's probable there was a spectrum from those who ate almost exclusively out to those who managed some very basic food preparation in. But the sheer number of thermopolia and food stalls strongly suggests that a huge market existed for ready-to-eat meals. So, the next time you see a bustling street food scene, whether in a modern city or in your imagination of ancient Rome, remember that it's not always just about convenience or culinary adventure. Sometimes it's born out of sheer necessity, a reflection of how people live and the limitations of their domestic spaces. The aroma of roasting meat from a Roman street stall wasn't just a tempting smell. For many, it was the scent of their daily dinner, a dinner they couldn't easily prepare themselves in their high-rise homes of antiquity. It makes you appreciate your own kitchen, doesn't it? Even if it's just a microwave and a mini fridge, it's probably palatial by the standards of an insular dweller, and it probably doesn't come with the risk of a chamber pot avalanche from the upstairs neighbour. Hopefully, now that you understand why so many Romans frequented these ancient fast food establishments, you might be wondering about the establishments themselves. What was their reputation? Were thermopolia and street food stalls seen as respectable businesses, or did they occupy a shadier, less savoury corner of Roman society? The answer, as with many things in history, is a bit complicated and likely depended on who you asked. For the common Roman, the plebs urbana, who relied on these places for their daily sustenance, a thermopolium was probably viewed with a mixture of practicality and perhaps a certain fondness. It was a place to get a hot meal quickly and cheaply, a place to meet friends, to catch up on news and gossip, a familiar part of the daily routine. The quality of food might vary, the hygiene might be questionable, but it served a vital need. You can imagine a stonemason covered in dust after a long day's work, looking forward to a cup of wine and a bowl of hot stew at his local thermopolium, a small comfort and a chance to unwind. For him, the reputation was probably good enough. However, if you were to ask a member of the Roman elite, a senator, a wealthy landowner, or a moralizing philosopher, you might get a very different, and often quite negative picture. Many upper-class Romans viewed these establishments with suspicion, even disdain. They were often seen as hangouts for the lower classes, places of idleness, drunkenness, gambling, and other unsavoury activities. Think of the way some people today might talk about seedy bars or down-market fast food joints. There's a similar vein of social snobbery and moral disapproval in some ancient Roman writings. The poet Horace, for example, sometimes wrote dismissively of the cheap food and wine found in such places, contrasting it with the refined pleasures of an elite dinner party. Juvenal, the master satirist, often painted a grim picture of the Roman underbelly, and while he didn't always single out thermopolia specifically for condemnation as dens of iniquity, the general environment he describes for the common folk, noisy, dirty and morally lax, would certainly encompass many such eateries. It's a recurring theme, places where different social classes mingled too freely, or where the lower orders congregated unsupervised, were often viewed with suspicion by the authorities and the elite. One of the reasons for this negative reputation was the association with activities beyond just eating and drinking. Many thermopolia and taverns, koponē or popinē, which were often similar but might offer lodging as well, were indeed places where gambling occurred. Dice games were hugely popular among Romans of all classes, but especially among the common folk, and these establishments provided a convenient venue. You might see men huddled in a corner, intensely focused on the roll of the dice, coins changing hands, arguments occasionally flaring up. This association with gambling, which was often technically illegal, or at least frowned upon by moralists, certainly didn't enhance their reputation in polite society. Furthermore, some of these establishments were suspected of being fronts for, or at least tolerant of, prostitution. While Rome had dedicated brothels, lupanaria, it's likely that some taverns and inns also facilitated such encounters. Waitresses or serving girls in these places sometimes doubled as sex workers, or assignations could be made there. This, of course, added to the perception of them as morally corrupting environments, especially in the eyes of conservative Romans who prized traditional virtues like modesty and sobriety, at least in public. You can almost hear a stern paterfamilias warning his son to stay away from those wretched popinē and their loose women. It's a mainstream historical fact that Roman law sometimes reflected this disapproval. There were various attempts throughout Roman history to regulate taverns and eating houses, to control their opening hours, to curb gambling, or to limit the types of food they could serve, sometimes under the guise of sumptuary laws aimed at preventing extravagance, even among the poor. The success of these regulations was often limited, as the demand for such places was so high. One quirky tidbit is the discovery of graffiti in some excavated thermopolia and taverns, particularly in Pompeii. These ancient scribblings on the walls give us a fascinating, unfiltered glimpse into the lives and preoccupations of their patrons. You find everything from declarations of love and crude jokes to records of debts, election slogans, and even complaints about the quality of the wine. Innkeeper, may your lies be the death of you. You sell water and drink the good wine yourself. This graffiti, sometimes obscene, sometimes humorous, sometimes mundane, confirms that these were lively, often rowdy places where ordinary people expressed themselves freely. It's the unsee. Single out thermopolia specifically for condemnation as dens of iniquity. The general environment he describes for the common folk, noisy, dirty, and morally lax, would certainly encompass many such eateries. It's a recurring theme, places where different social classes mingled too freely, or where the lower orders congregated unsupervised, were often viewed with suspicion by the authorities and the elite. One of the reasons for this negative reputation was the association with activities beyond just eating and drinking. Many thermopolias and taverns, koponae or popinae, which were often similar but might offer lodging as well, were indeed places where gambling occurred. Dice games were hugely popular among Romans of all classes, but especially among the common folk, and these establishments provided a convenient venue. You might see men huddled in a corner, intensely focused on the roll of the dice, coins changing hands, arguments occasionally flaring up. This association with gambling, which was often technically illegal, or at least frowned upon by moralists, certainly didn't enhance their reputation in polite society. Furthermore, some of these establishments were suspected of being fronts for, or at least tolerant of, prostitution. While Rome had dedicated brothels, lupanaria, it's likely that some taverns and inns also facilitated such encounters. Waitresses or serving girls in these places sometimes doubled as sex workers, or assignations could be made there. This, of course, added to the perception of them as morally corrupting environments, especially in the eyes of conservative Romans who prized traditional virtues like modesty and sobriety, at least in public. You can almost hear a stern paterfamilias warning his son to stay away from those wretched popinae and their loose women. It's a mainstream historical fact that Roman law sometimes reflected this disapproval. There were various attempts throughout Roman history to regulate taverns and eating houses, to control their opening hours, to curb gambling, or to limit the types of food they could serve, sometimes under the guise of sumptuary laws aimed at preventing extravagance, even among the poor. The success of these regulations was often limited, as the demand for such places was so high. One quirky tidbit is the discovery of graffiti in some excavated thermopolia and taverns, particularly in Pompeii. These ancient scribblings on the walls give us a fascinating, unfiltered glimpse into the lives and preoccupations of their patrons. You find everything from declarations of love and crude jokes to records of debts, election slogans, and even complaints about the quality of the wine. Innkeeper, may your lies be the death of you. You sell water and drink the good wine yourself. This graffiti, sometimes obscene, sometimes humorous, sometimes mundane, confirms that these were lively, often rowdy places where ordinary people expressed themselves freely. It's the ancient equivalent of writing on the bathroom stall, and it paints a much more vibrant, if sometimes less refined, picture than the condemnations of elite authors. Historians still argue about the precise distinctions between a thermopolium, a popina, and a copona. The terms are often used somewhat interchangeably in ancient texts, and the functions could overlap. Generally, a thermopolium seems to have focused primarily on selling hot food to go, a popina was more of a simple restaurant or eating house where you might sit down, and a copona was an inn that also offered food and drink. But the lines were blurry, and a single establishment might offer elements of all three. What is clear is that they catered to a clientele that was often on the lower end of the social spectrum, or at least those who were not part of the landowning, slave-owning elite. So, was your local Roman street food vendor a purveyor of much-needed sustenance or a corrupter of public morals? Probably a bit of both, depending on your perspective and the specific establishment. For every vendor simply trying to make an honest living selling beans and bread, There might have been another whose backroom hosted illegal dice games, or whose cheap wine flowed a little too freely, leading to late-night brawls. The reputation of these places was a mixed bag, reflecting the complex, often contradictory nature of Roman urban society itself. A society that needed these services but often looked down on those who provided them and those who relied on them most. It's a classic case of can't live with them, can't live without them. And as you, a time-travelling tourist, navigate these streets, you are, for a moment, part of that less celebrated but arguably more vital segment of Roman life. Having navigated the somewhat morally ambiguous world of the Roman tavern and street stall, it's worth taking a moment to zoom out and consider the stark contrast between these everyday eating experiences of the common Roman and the legendary culinary extravaganzas of the wealthy elite. The gulf between a hurried lunch of sausage and bread, eaten standing up in a noisy thermopolium, and a leisurely multi-course banquet, cena, in a patrician's domus, was not just a difference in ingredients or preparation. It was a chasm that reflected the deeply stratified nature of Roman society. Imagine yourself having just finished your street food snack, perhaps wiping greasy fingers on a piece of now discarded leaf. Now transport yourself just for a moment into the dining room, triclinium, of a wealthy Roman noble later that same evening. The scene is entirely different. Instead of a crowded, noisy street, you're in a beautifully decorated room, its walls adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, or perhaps intricate geometric patterns. The floor might be a stunning mosaic, a work of art in itself. Instead of standing or perching precariously, you and the other guests are reclining on cushioned couches, arranged in a U-shape around a central table. This reclining posture for dining, strange as it seems to us, was the height of Roman sophistication for formal meals. The air is not filled with the smell of roasting street meat and stale wine, but with expensive perfumes, incense, and the subtle, complex aromas of a meticulously planned feast. Soft music might be playing, a lyre, a flute, and perhaps professional entertainers, dancers, or poets are present to amuse the guests between courses. The lighting is from elegant oil lamps, casting a warm, inviting glow. This is not just about eating. It's about an entire sensory experience, a display of wealth, status, and culture. And the food! Forget simple stews and coarse bread. The banquet would begin with the gustatio, appetizers, a selection of light, stimulating dishes, perhaps eggs prepared in various ways, olives, of the finest quality of course, fresh salads, unlike the often avoided raw street vegetables, these would be prepared with care, shellfish like oysters and mussels, and small delicate morsels of seasoned meat or fish. And accompanying this, not the rough, watered-down plonk of the street, but carefully selected wines, perhaps from famous vineyards, served by attentive slaves from ornate jugs. Then would come the main courses, the primi mensae. This was where the host could truly show off. There might be several elaborate dishes, featuring expensive and exotic ingredients. Roasted meats would certainly be present, but not just simple sausages. Think whole roasted boar, stuffed with other game birds, peacock, its feathers reattached for a spectacular presentation, suckling pig, or perhaps dormice, fattened in special terracotta jars and served glazed with honey and poppy seeds. Remember them from the street, but now elevated to a delicacy. Fish dishes would be equally impressive. Large prize sea bass or red mullet, perhaps baked in intricate sauces or presented in elaborate moulds. The Romans, particularly the wealthy, were fond of surprise dishes, food disguised to look like something else, or with unexpected fillings. This culinary trickery was a mark of a skilled chef. Sauces would be complex and numerous, often involving that high-end garum sociorum we talked about, mixed with expensive spices imported from the East. Pepper, a status symbol in itself, cloves, ginger, saffron. Vegetables would be prepared with care, perhaps asparagus tips, artichoke hearts, or exotic mushrooms, often served with rich dressings. Bread would be of the finest white flour, perhaps in various shapes and flavours. Within the empire, it was undoubtedly a massive expense for the state, and maintaining the supply lines across the Mediterranean was a constant preoccupation. When those supply lines were disrupted, as sometimes happened due to piracy, storms, or political upheaval in the grain-producing provinces, the consequences in Rome could be severe.
The phrase bread and circuses itself has come to have a somewhat pejorative meaning today, often used to describe a government's attempt to appease the populace with superficial benefits rather than addressing real problems. Whether this is a fair assessment of the Roman system is debatable. For many Romans, the annona was not a superficial benefit, but a lifeline, and the circuses, while brutal, were a deeply ingrained part of Roman culture and social life, not just a cynical distraction. So, as you observe the hustle and bustle of the Roman street, remember that the food being bought and sold exists within this larger context of state-controlled sustenance and mass entertainment. The vendor selling bread is part of an economic web that extends all the way to the wheat fields of Egypt and the emperor's palace on the Palatine Hill. The laughter and shouts from a nearby amphitheatre are the other side of the coin, the circuses that went hand in hand with the bread. It's a reminder that in Rome, food was power, food was politics, and a full stomach was often the price of peace. The simple act of eating on the street is, in its own small way, connected to the grand machinery of empire. Finally, if you still had any room, would come the secundae mensae, dessert. This would typically feature fresh fruits, grapes, figs, pomegranates, melons, as well as nuts and sweet pastries or cakes, far more refined than the simple honey cakes of the street. These desserts would also be sweetened with honey, but perhaps combined with rare fruits or expensive nuts, and presented with artistic flair. The sheer quantity and variety of food at such a banquet could be staggering. It's a mainstream historical fact that some Roman emperors and extremely wealthy individuals were notorious for the extravagance of their feasts. Tales of banquets lasting for hours, with dozens of courses and outlandish dishes, flamingo tongues anyone, have come down to us through writers like Suetonius and Petronius, whose Trimalchio's dinner, in the Satyricon, is a famous satirical depiction of a vulgar nouveau riche feast. While these accounts might sometimes be exaggerated for effect, they reflect a culture where conspicuous consumption through food was a significant way of displaying power and wealth. One quirky tidbit associated with these elite feasts is the vomitorium. This word is often misunderstood to mean a room where Romans went to deliberately throw up so they could eat more. While the image is certainly memorable and fits with the idea of extreme indulgence, vomitoria were actually the entrance-exit passages in amphitheatres and theatres, designed to allow large crowds to enter and disperse quickly, from vomere to spew forth. While it's true that some Romans at banquets might have overindulged to the point of sickness, or even intentionally purged themselves, they wouldn't have retired to a dedicated vomiting room. This misunderstanding, however, has certainly coloured popular perceptions of Roman decadence. A more historically accurate, if still eyebrow-raising practice, was the use of feather ticklers at the back of the throat to induce vomiting if one felt uncomfortably full but wished to continue partaking. Classy. Historians still argue about how representative the accounts of extreme banquets are. Were these truly typical of the elite? Or were they the excesses of a particularly ostentatious few, amplified by satirists and moralists? It's likely that most wealthy Romans ate well, but perhaps not always with the absurd extravagance depicted in the most lurid tales. Nevertheless, even a modest elite dinner would have been a world away from the commoner's daily fare. So as you stand metaphorically between these two worlds, the steaming thermopolium counter and the perfumed triclinium, the contrast is stark. For the vast majority, food was about sustenance, fuel, and simple, immediate satisfaction. For the tiny minority at the top, it was about pleasure, status, art, and an almost theatrical display of abundance. The street food vendor offered you a sausage, the banquet host offered you a spectacle, and this fundamental difference in the experience of something as basic as eating underscores the vast social and economic inequalities that characterized the Roman world, a world where what you ate and how you ate it spoke volumes about who you were. The ready availability of cheap food on the streets and the elaborate feasts of the wealthy paint a picture of Rome as a city preoccupied with eating. But food in Rome, especially for the masses, wasn't just about individual hunger or social display. It was also a powerful tool of statecraft, deeply intertwined with public entertainment and social stability. This brings us to the concept of the annona, often famously summarized by the poet Juvenal's phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses. The annona, in its broadest sense, referred to the state-organized system for procuring and distributing grain, and later, other essential foodstuffs like olive oil and pork to the populace of Rome, either for free or at a heavily subsidised below-market price. As the city of Rome grew to an unprecedented size, feeding its enormous population became a monumental logistical challenge. Most of the grain had to be imported, primarily from fertile provinces like Egypt, North Africa and Sicily. Ensuring a steady, reliable supply was a critical concern for Roman emperors and officials. A shortage of grain could lead to hunger, riots and political instability. No emperor wanted a hungry mob on his hands. That was a recipe for losing power, or even your life. So, the annona became a cornerstone of imperial policy. At various times in Roman history, hundreds of thousands of eligible citizens, usually adult males registered in Rome, were entitled to receive a monthly dole of grain. This wasn't just a welfare program, it was a political necessity. By providing this basic sustenance, the state aimed to keep the urban populace fed, quiescent, and hopefully loyal. You can imagine the scene on distribution days, long queues of people, perhaps with sacks or baskets, waiting to receive their allocation of wheat. This grain wasn't necessarily ready-to-eat bread from a street vendor, but the raw material that could then be taken to a miller and a baker, or perhaps used to make a simple porridge at home if one had the facilities. The connection to circuses, or public entertainments, is crucial. The Roman state didn't just provide food, it also provided spectacular, often brutal, entertainment in the form of gladiatorial games, chariot races in the Circus Maximus, animal hunts, venationes, and public executions. These events were hugely popular and served as another means of keeping the populace occupied and distracted from their daily hardships or potential political grievances. By offering both panem, bread, and circenses, or games, the emperors could cultivate popularity and maintain a degree of social control. It was a quid pro quo. The people got food and entertainment, and the emperor got relative peace and support. It's a mainstream historical fact that the scale of these distributions and games was immense. The Circus Maximus, for example, could supposedly hold over 150,000 spectators, all baying for excitement and implicitly grateful to the emperor who provided it. How does this relate to the street food you've been exploring? While the annona primarily distributed raw grain, its existence had an indirect impact on the street food scene. A populace that had access to free or cheap grain had more disposable income, however meagre, to spend on other things, including prepared foods from vendors. If your basic calorie needs were partly met by the state, you might be more inclined to spend a few asses on a sausage, a cup of wine, or a honey cake as a supplement or a treat. Furthermore, the logistics of the annona, the massive granaries, horea, built to store the imported grain, the bureaucracy involved in its distribution, all underscored the central role of food in the city's life. Some of these granaries were colossal structures, marvels of Roman engineering, designed to hold months' worth of supply. The presence of so much grain in the city also supported a thriving industry of millers and bakers, some of whom might also have supplied street vendors with bread or other baked goods. One quirky tidbit related to the annona is the use of special tokens or tesserae. These small tokens, often made of lead, bronze or clay, were sometimes used as vouchers for the grain dole. An eligible citizen might receive a tessera that could then be exchanged for their measure of grain. These tesserae could be quite simple, or they might bear images or inscriptions related to the emperor or the specific distribution. Finding one of these ancient food stamps would be a fascinating little piece of social history. Historians still argue about the long-term effects of the annona system. Some see it as a pragmatic and necessary measure to manage a huge urban population and prevent starvation. Others argue that it created a dependent populace, discouraged local agriculture around Rome, as farmers couldn't compete with subsidised grain, and contributed to economic imbalances. Furthermore, there was a strong emphasis in Roman culture on a certain ideal of rustic simplicity and moderation, at least in theory. Writers like Cato the Elder praised the virtues of a simple diet based on homegrown produce, contrasting it with the perceived decadence and ill health associated with luxury and overindulgence. While this was often a moralizing trope, it suggests an underlying awareness that too much rich food, or food that was overly processed or artificial, was not ideal. So, while they lacked our scientific understanding of nutrition, the Romans were not oblivious to the connection between diet and health. They had their own complex system for understanding how food affected the body, and they certainly recognised that some foods were better for you than others. A Roman physician might not have warned you about trans fats in your fried globules, but he might have cautioned that too many such hot and oily treats could lead to an unhealthy accumulation of phlegm or bile, especially if you were of a choleric temperament. It's a different framework, but the underlying concern for well-being through diet is there, and just like today, there was probably a gap between what the experts advised and what people actually ate, especially when faced with a tempting, cheap and convenient street food snack. The allure of the Roman equivalent of a guilty pleasure was likely just as strong then as it is now. One quirky tidbit related to imported flavours is the Roman fondness for silphium. Silphium was a plant that grew only in a narrow coastal region of Cyrenaica, modern Libya. Its resin was used as both a pungent flavouring and a versatile medicine. It was so popular and valuable that it was eventually harvested to extinction, probably by the 1st century AD. Before it disappeared, silphium was a legendary ingredient, and its unique flavour, described as being somewhat like garlic or a saffetida but distinct, was highly sought after. You can imagine a vendor in the earlier days of the empire perhaps offering a special dish seasoned with a tiny, precious scraping of silphium resin, a true taste of the exotic and the rare. The story of silphium is a fascinating early example of a foodstuff being loved to death. Historians still argue about the extent to which these imported luxury flavours truly permeated down to the level of common street food. Was it just the elite who enjoyed pepper and ginger, or did diluted or ersatz versions make their way to the masses? It's likely that the most expensive imports remained largely exclusive. However, the presence of these new tastes in the city would have broadened the overall culinary vocabulary. Just as today, foreign cuisines influence local food scenes, introducing new flavours and ingredients that gradually become incorporated and adapted. Perhaps a Roman street vendor, having heard tales of exotic spices from a sailor or a merchant, might experiment with new combinations of local herbs to try and capture a hint of that distant allure. The vast network of Roman roads and shipping lanes didn't just carry soldiers and administrators, it carried goods, ideas, and tastes. A shipment of dates from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, garum from Lusitania, and spices from India all converging on Rome would have created a vibrant cosmopolitan marketplace. While the everyday Roman might not be directly consuming large quantities of these exotic imports, the city itself was a melting pot of flavours. The street food scene, in its own humble way, would have reflected this perhaps through a slightly wider range of ingredients than you might find in a small isolated village, or through the occasional special offer of something a bit more unusual. So, as you bite into your Roman snack, consider the journey its ingredients might have taken. The wheat for your bread might be from Sicily, the olive oil, if any was used, from Spain, the wine from a local Italian vineyard. But the hint of a particular herb, or the type of fruit in your sweet cake might whisper of lands far beyond the horizon. Rome's appetite was vast and its reach was long, and even the simplest street food could carry a faint intriguing echo of the empire's global connections. As you continue your imagined stroll through the Roman streets, munching on your ancient snacks, you might start to notice the sheer variety of not just the people, but also the subtle hints of flavours and ingredients that seem, well, not entirely local. While much of the street food is based on staples like bread, olives and common meats, Rome was the heart of a vast empire, a nexus of trade routes that spanned continents. And inevitably, some of the exotic tastes and ingredients that flowed into the capital from distant lands would have trickled down, in some form, to influence even the humble fare of the street vendor. Think of the spices. We've mentioned pepper, which was a highly prized luxury imported all the way from India. While a street vendor probably wasn't lacing his cheap sausages with copious amounts of black pepper, its presence in the city, and its association with wealth and sophisticated taste, might have inspired the use of more readily available, locally grown hot spices or pungent herbs to mimic that desirable kick. Perhaps a vendor might have a special batch of sausages advertised as piperatum, peppered, using a tiny amount of real pepper mixed with other cheaper flavourings to justify a slightly higher price. Or they might use long pepper, a related but distinct spice also imported. Other spices from the east, like ginger, cloves, cinnamon and nutmeg, also made their way to Rome.
though they were generally very expensive and reserved for the kitchens of the wealthy or for medicinal purposes. However, their aroma and the allure of the exotic might have influenced local tastes. Perhaps a sweet cake vendor might offer a version with a hint of cinnamon, or its less expensive cousin cassia, advertising it as a taste of the Orient. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Roman trade with India and the Far East, via both land, the Silk Road and sea routes, was extensive and brought a wealth of luxury goods, including spices, silks and precious stones, into the empire. Fruits from other parts of the empire would also have appeared in Roman markets, and some might have found their way into street food. Dates, for example, were widely imported from North Africa and the Middle East, and their intense sweetness made them a popular snack, either eaten plain or incorporated into desserts. Peaches, originally from Persia, their Latin name, Melon persicum, means Persian apple, became cultivated in Italy and would have been a seasonal treat. Lemons and oranges, specifically bitter oranges at this time, were gradually introduced from further east, though they were initially rare and expensive novelties, perhaps more likely to be found in a rich person's garden or on their table than in a street vendor's basket, but their presence was beginning to be felt. Nuts, too, reflected the reach of the empire. While hazelnuts and walnuts were native, almonds were introduced from the eastern Mediterranean, and pistachios came from Syria and the Near East. These could be sold roasted and salted by street vendors, or incorporated into those honeyed sweets we discussed. Imagine a vendor offering a choice: local hazelnuts, or for a slightly higher price, exotic pistachios. Even the ubiquitous garum could have an exotic twist. While most was made from local Mediterranean fish, special, high-value garum was imported from places like Lusitania, modern Portugal, or Baetica, southern Spain, prized for the specific types of fish used or particular production methods. The amphorae themselves, bearing stamps and labels from distant ports, were a testament to this long-distance trade in flavour. One quirky tidbit related to Roman waste is the practice of swept floor mosaics, or asarotos oikos. These were a type of mosaic design, popular in some wealthy Roman dining rooms, that cleverly depicted food scraps: fish bones, fruit peels, nutshells, even a rogue mouse nibbling a crumb, scattered on the floor as if they were the leftovers from a lavish banquet. It was a playful, trompe-l'oeil artistic convention, but it also perhaps subtly hints at the reality that, even in elegant settings, some mess was expected. It's a bit like having a designer carpet with a pre-installed coffee stain. An odd concept, but it speaks to a certain acceptance of life's little messes. Historians still argue about the overall effectiveness and organisation of Roman urban sanitation. Some scholars emphasise the advanced engineering of the sewers and aqueducts as evidence of a sophisticated approach to public health. Others point to the literary descriptions of filthy streets and the archaeological evidence of widespread parasites, from studying latrine deposits and skeletal remains, to argue that, despite the impressive infrastructure, daily life for many Romans was lived in rather unsanitary conditions. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Rome was a city of immense contrasts, and sanitation levels likely varied greatly between the grand public spaces and the poorer residential quarters. So as you imagine yourself finishing your Roman street food, you'd be faced with a disposal dilemma. There's no convenient trash can in sight. You might discreetly drop your refuse near a pile of other rubbish, trying not to add too conspicuously to the urban detritus. Or you might see a scavenging dog eye your leftovers with interest. It's a less glamorous aspect of ancient life, but an important one. The management or mismanagement of waste is a fundamental challenge for any large urban centre, ancient or modern, and in Rome, the sheer volume of people and the limitations of their disposal methods meant that the streets themselves often served as the primary repository for the city's unwanted remnants, a constant, fragrant reminder of the daily cycle of consumption and discard. Having sampled a variety of Roman street foods, from savoury sausages to sweet honey cakes, and considered the vast trade networks that supplied the city, a modern question inevitably arises. Did the Romans worry about healthy eating? Did they have concepts similar to our notions of nutrition, diet, and the potential ill effects of consuming too much junk food? It's a fascinating area to explore, as their understanding of the body and food was naturally very different from ours, yet not entirely without its own logic. The Romans certainly had ideas about which foods were considered wholesome and which were not. These ideas were often based on the theories of Greek physicians like Hippocrates and later Galen, whose influence on Western medicine lasted for over a millennium. Galen, who lived and worked in Rome during the 2nd century AD, was particularly influential. His theories were based on the concept of the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and the idea that health depended on maintaining a balance between them. Foods were classified according to their supposed properties: hot, cold, moist, dry, and their effects on these humours. So a Roman physician, if asked about the healthiness of street food, wouldn't talk about calories, saturated fats, or vitamin deficiencies. Instead, he might analyse the meal in terms of its humoral properties. For example, a greasy, spicy sausage might be considered hot and moist, and could be deemed unsuitable for someone with an excess of hot humours, perhaps leading to inflammation or fever. Conversely, it might be recommended for someone who was considered too cold and dry. Bread, depending on the type of grain and how it was prepared, would have its own properties. Wine, especially when diluted, was often considered generally healthy, aiding digestion and lifting the spirits, though excessive consumption was, of course, discouraged by moralists and physicians alike. Fruits and vegetables were generally considered good, but their specific properties mattered. Some vegetables, like cucumbers, were deemed cold and moist, while others, like garlic or onions, were hot. The key was balance, both in the meal itself and in relation to the individual's constitution and current state of health. It's a mainstream historical fact that Galen wrote extensively on dietetics, emphasising the importance of choosing appropriate foods for maintaining health and treating illness. His works were studied for centuries, and his dietary advice, though based on humoral theory, often included common-sense recommendations like moderation and the consumption of fresh, unprocessed foods when possible. Did ancient physicians comment specifically on street food? While they might not have used the term junk food, they certainly commented on the eating habits of different social classes and the quality of food available to them. Galen, for instance, recognised that the poor often had limited food choices and might consume coarser, less easily digestible foods. He might have cautioned against food from vendors if he suspected it was old, poorly prepared, or made with inferior ingredients, as this could lead to digestive upsets or an imbalance of the humours. There was a general understanding that fresh, well-prepared food was better for health. One quirky tidbit is the Roman attitude towards certain gassy foods. Legumes like beans and lentils, which were a staple for many common Romans and likely a common offering at thermopolia, were known to cause flatulence. While this might seem like a minor social embarrassment to us, some Roman physicians and writers took it quite seriously, as excessive gas was thought to disturb the body's internal balance and could even be considered a sign of poor digestion or ill health. There were even discussions about which beans were gassier than others, and how to prepare them to minimise this effect. Soaking and thorough cooking, for example, advice that still holds true. So, your hearty bowl of Roman bean stew might have come with a side of medical concern about its gaseous aftermath. Historians still argue about how much the average Roman on the street would have known or cared about these sophisticated medical theories. While the educated elite might have consulted physicians like Galen and meticulously planned their diets according to humoral principles, the common labourer buying a quick lunch was probably more concerned with filling their stomach and getting value for money than with balancing their humours. However, some general folk wisdom about which foods were heavy or light, heating or cooling, likely permeated society. People would have learned from experience which foods agreed with them and which caused discomfort. So your food day might look like this: a quick bread and wine intaculum, a more varied street food prandium of stew or sausage, and a cena that might be a simple home-cooked or home-assembled meal, or another purchase from a local vendor, perhaps something a bit more substantial like a vegetable and grain pottage. Throughout the day, snacks might also feature a piece of fruit, a handful of nuts, or one of those honey cakes if you felt like a treat. One quirky tidbit about Roman mealtimes is that they didn't have the same rigid 3 meals a day structure that many modern cultures do. While the intaculum, prandium and cena were recognised meal occasions, their timing and importance could vary depending on social class, occupation and individual habits. Some Romans might have skipped ientaculum altogether, or had a very light prandium, saving their main appetite for cena. The rhythm of the agricultural day also influenced mealtimes in rural areas, which might differ from the patterns in the bustling city.
historians still argue about the precise nutritional adequacy of the common Roman diet, especially for those heavily reliant on street food. While staples like whole grains, legumes and vegetables, when available and properly prepared, could provide a decent foundation, access to sufficient protein and micronutrients might have been a concern for the poorer segments of the population. The quality and hygiene of street food, as we've noted, could also be highly variable, posing risks of foodborne illness. However, the sheer fact that the city of Rome sustained such a large population for centuries suggests that, on the whole, people were getting enough to survive and function, even if their diet wasn't always perfectly balanced or gourmet. Your Roman food day, then, is a tapestry woven from necessity, convenience, and the limited choices available to you. It's a world away from the carefully curated menus and abundant pantries of the elite. It's a cycle of simple, often repetitive meals, punctuated by the occasional small treat, all consumed against the backdrop of a noisy, demanding city. It's a reminder that for most people throughout history, food has been primarily about getting by, about fueling the body for another day's labour, and the Roman street food scene was a direct, unvarnished expression of that fundamental human need. Having explored the types of food available, the challenges of preservation, and even ancient Roman ideas about healthy eating, another very practical question looms. What happened to all the leftovers and food waste? In a city as enormous and densely populated as Rome, with countless thermopolia, street stalls, private kitchens, and banquets producing organic refuse daily, waste management must have been a significant issue. You can't just toss your half-eaten sausage and fig leaves anywhere, can you? Or could you? The reality of ancient Roman waste disposal was, by modern standards, rather haphazard and often unpleasant. While Rome was famed for its engineering marvels like aqueducts and sewers, the Cloaca Maxima being the most famous. These sewers were primarily designed for draining wastewater, storm runoff, and perhaps the effluent from public latrines, not for carrying away vast quantities of solid household or commercial waste. There wasn't a municipal garbage collection service with trucks coming around on a regular schedule to pick up your neatly bagged trash. So, what did happen to that leftover bit of stew, the fish bones, the fruit cores, the spoiled food that even a Roman couldn't stomach? A lot of it, unfortunately, probably ended up being thrown directly into the streets. Remember Juvenal's complaints about things being tossed from the windows of insulae? That wouldn't just have been wastewater, it would have included organic refuse. The streets of Rome, especially in the poorer, more crowded districts, were likely quite filthy, with accumulated garbage a common sight and smell. Street cleaners, if they existed in any organised fashion, would have had an unenviable and never-ending task. You can imagine pigs, dogs, and rats. Yes, Rome had plenty of those, scavenging through these piles of refuse, a sort of unofficial four-legged clean-up crew. Some waste might have been collected by individuals for specific purposes. For example, alec, that fish paste left over from garum production, was sometimes used as fertiliser or animal feed. Other organic scraps might have been gathered by enterprising individuals to feed their own animals if they kept any. Perhaps a few chickens or a pig in a small urban yard, though this was less common in the dense city centre. Larger establishments like big thermopolia or the kitchens of wealthy domus might have had slightly more organised ways of dealing with their waste. They might have designated refuse pits or middens on their property or nearby where waste was dumped. Archaeologists have excavated such middens, and they provide a treasure trove of information about ancient diets and daily life, revealing discarded animal bones, pottery shards, oyster shells, and carbonised food remains. These ancient garbage dumps are like time capsules. There's also evidence that some waste was transported out of the city. Carts might have been used, especially at night, when wheeled traffic restrictions were often lifted, to haul refuse to dumping grounds located outside the city walls. One famous example, though primarily for non-organic waste like broken pottery, is Monte Testaccio. This artificial hill in Rome is made up almost entirely of discarded Roman amphorae, mostly those used for transporting olive oil from Baetica, Spain. Over centuries, tens of millions of these broken vessels were systematically dumped and arranged there, creating a literal mountain of ancient trash. It's a mainstream historical fact that Monte Testaccio stands today as a massive, tangible monument to Roman consumption and waste. While it's mostly pottery, It illustrates the scale of the disposal challenge. What about food waste from vendors specifically? A vendor aiming to make a profit would try to minimise waste as much as possible. As we discussed, they'd try to cook only what they could sell and repurpose leftovers if feasible. Spoiled food represented a loss of income. However, some spoilage was inevitable. That rancid bit of cheese or the stew that had clearly seen better days would have to be disposed of. It might be discreetly tossed onto a local rubbish heap, or perhaps sold off very, very cheaply to the truly desperate, or even given to beggars. Now that we've explored the vibrant street food scene, the challenges of preservation, the reasons for eating out, the reputations of these establishments, the contrast with elite dining, the role of the annona, the influence of exotic imports, Roman ideas about healthy eating, and even the messy business of ancient waste disposal. Let's try to pull it all together and imagine a typical Roman's food day, particularly for someone who relied on these convenient ready-made options. We're not talking about the senator with his private chefs, but more about an ordinary city dweller, perhaps an artisan, a shopkeeper, or a clerk. Your day, as such a Roman, would likely start early. The city wakes before dawn, and there's work to be done. For your first meal, the ientaculum, the breakfast, you probably wouldn't be having a large cooked affair. Time is precious. More likely, it would be something quick and simple, perhaps eaten on the go or just before leaving your small room in the insula. This might consist of a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine. Remember, wine was a breakfast drink too. Or water, or maybe with a little cheese or a few olives if you had them on hand. Some historians suggest that leftovers from the previous evening's cena, dinner, might also have been consumed for ientaculum. It was essentially a functional meal, just enough to get you started. You might even grab this from a very early opening street vendor or a local baker if you didn't have provisions at home. A bread roll, still warm from the oven. As the morning progresses and you're busy with your work, hunger might start to set in again around midday. This is when you'd seek out prandium, the Roman lunch. For many, especially those working away from home or without cooking facilities, this would be prime time for street food. You'd head to a nearby thermopolium or a bustling area with various food stalls. This is where the options we've been discussing come into play. You might choose a hearty bowl of stewed lentils or beans with a chunk of coarse bread, perhaps a smoky lucanica sausage, or some grilled meat skewers. If you were near the port or a fish market, maybe some fried fish. You'd wash it down with a cup of watered wine or posca. The prandium was generally a more substantial meal than breakfast, but still relatively quick and informal for most working people. It was about refuelling for the afternoon's tasks. You'd eat standing at the counter or find a spot to sit on a public bench or a doorstep. No lengthy lunch breaks here. Efficiency was key. The main meal of the day for the Romans was the cena, or dinner. For the wealthy, as we've seen, this could be an elaborate multi-course affair starting in the late afternoon and lasting well into the evening. For our ordinary Roman, however, the cena would be simpler, though ideally more substantial than prandium. If they had some basic cooking facilities, perhaps a shared hearth or a more tolerant landlord regarding braziers, they might prepare something at home with ingredients bought from the market, vegetables, grains, perhaps a small piece of meat or fish if the budget allowed. But for many insular dwellers, especially those living alone or in very cramped conditions, even preparing a simple cena at home was a challenge. Therefore, it's quite plausible that a significant number of common Romans would also rely on street vendors or thermopolia for their evening meal, or at least part of it. Perhaps they'd buy a portion of hot stew and some bread to take back to their room, or they might eat at a popina, a simple eating house that offered a slightly more relaxed atmosphere than a takeaway stall, perhaps with a few tables and a chance to socialise. The cena for the common person would likely still feature staples like pulse, a thick porridge made from grains like emmer wheat or barley, often enriched with vegetables, cheese, or small bits of meat, various vegetable dishes, bread, and of course, wine. It's a mainstream historical fact that pulse was a foundational dish in the Roman diet for centuries, especially before bread became universally common. It was the Roman equivalent of polenta or grits, a versatile and filling base for many meals. Historians still argue about the overall health and nutritional status of the rural Roman population compared to their urban counterparts. On one hand, rural dwellers might have had more consistent access to fresh, unprocessed food from their own land, and their physically active lifestyle was beneficial. On the other hand, they were more vulnerable to localized famines if their crops failed. and their diet, while perhaps fresher, might have been more monotonous and lacking in certain micronutrients at times, depending on the region and the season. Access to a wide variety of goods, including imported ones, would have been much more limited than in the city. The concept of eating out in a rural village would also be different. There might be a local kupona inn on a main road passing through, which could serve food and drink to travellers and locals, but these would be fewer and farther between than the ubiquitous thermopolia of Rome. Social life, including shared meals, would more likely revolve around family, neighbours and village festivals or religious celebrations, where food would be prepared and shared communally. So, the fast food of the countryside was less about commercial transaction, and more about immediate practical sustenance drawn from the land itself or from simple home preparations. A sun-warmed fig plucked from a branch, a handful of roasted chickpeas, a piece of coarse bread with a smear of meritum. These were the convenient bites that fueled rural Roman life. It's a quieter, more earth-bound culinary world than the chaotic cosmopolitan streets of Rome, but one that was equally vital in sustaining the empire. The farmer in his field and the artisan in his city workshop were two sides of the same Roman coin, each with their own distinct ways of finding a quick, satisfying mouthful to keep them going. One quirky tidbit comes from Roman Spain, Hispania, which was a major producer of olive oil, wine, and that prized garum. In Spanish coastal towns, you might find street vendors selling tapas-like small bites, perhaps some salted fish, a few olives, a piece of local cheese, or even small fried seafood. The Iberians had their own culinary traditions before Roman conquest, including a love for pork and seafood, which would have blended with Roman influences. The abundance of high-quality local ingredients would have shaped the street food offerings. Historians still argue about the extent to which a standardized Roman diet was imposed or adopted across the empire, versus the persistence and adaptation of local food traditions. It was likely a two-way street. Roman military presence and administration would have introduced certain Roman staples, like wheat bread, wine, and olive oil, were not previously common, and methods of food preparation. However, local ingredients and tastes were resilient and often incorporated into a kind of Romano-provincial hybrid cuisine. A thermopolium. In Britain might look structurally similar to one in Pompeii, with its L-shaped counter and dolia, but the specific dishes simmering within those pots would reflect local availability and preferences. The concept of fast food, quick, convenient and relatively cheap meals, is universal, but its specific manifestation is always local. The Roman Empire, for all its efforts at cultural and administrative homogenization in some areas, could not entirely erase the deep-rooted culinary identities of its diverse provinces. A soldier or a merchant travelling across the empire would have encountered a fascinating, ever-changing menu of street foods, each reflecting the unique character of its region. From the oatcakes of Caledonia to the date cakes of Alexandria, the empire was a smorgasbord of local flavours, all existing under the umbrella of Roman rule. This provincial diversity is what made the Roman culinary world so rich, and even in its humblest street food form so endlessly interesting. Having spent so much time imagining the clamour and culinary offerings of Rome's bustling streets, it's important to remember that the Roman Empire wasn't just its capital city. The vast majority of the empire's population lived outside Rome, in smaller towns, villages and rural agricultural areas. Their food habits, and what might constitute their version of junk food or convenience meals, would have been shaped by a very different set of circumstances, resources and lifestyles. Let's take a mental journey away from the towering insulae and crowded thermopolia and into the Roman countryside. Life in rural areas was, unsurprisingly, dictated by the agricultural seasons and the availability of locally produced food. While a city like Rome relied heavily on imports to feed its massive populace, rural communities largely consumed what they grew or raised themselves, or what was available in their immediate vicinity. Their diet would have been far more seasonal and in many ways simpler, and perhaps less diverse on a day-to-day basis, than what could be found in a large urban market. Imagine a farmer working his fields from dawn till dusk. His meals would need to be hearty and sustaining, but also practical. His ientaculum might be similar to the city dwellers: bread, perhaps some olives or cheese, maybe some fruit in season. His prandium, however, wouldn't be from a street vendor. It would more likely be a packed meal eaten in the shade of a tree: more bread, some vegetables, perhaps raw like cucumbers or radishes, or leftovers from the previous night's cooking, some hard cheese and water or posca from a flask. Convenience here means portable and non-perishable, rather than bought hot from a stall. The evening cena in a rural household would be the main meal, cooked at home over an open hearth or in a simple oven. It would feature whatever was in season from their own garden or fields, grains like wheat, barley or millet prepared as bread or pulse, legumes like lentils, chickpeas and fava beans, a variety of vegetables such as cabbages, onions, garlic, turnips, and leafy greens. Meat would be less common for everyday meals compared to the city, where butchers and markets provided a more regular supply. A rural family might eat meat from their own livestock, pigs, chickens, goats, on special occasions, or if an animal was slaughtered. Hunting or trapping small game might also supplement the diet. Fish would be common near rivers, lakes, or the coast. So what about junk food or quick convenient snacks in this rural context? It wouldn't take the form of a thermopolium. Instead, it might be things like fresh, seasonal fruit eaten straight from the tree or vine, figs, grapes, apples, pears. This is nature's fast food, requiring no preparation. Roasted grains or nuts. Farmers might roast some freshly harvested wheat or barley grains, or forage for nuts like chestnuts or acorns, which were eaten in some areas after being processed to remove bitterness, providing a quick, energy-rich snack. Simple baked goods. If a communal oven was available in the village, or if the family had their own, they might bake small rustic flatbreads or buns that could be easily carried and eaten. Preserved foods, dried fruits, salted meat, like homemade jerky, or pickled vegetables would be available for a quick bite, especially during seasons when fresh produce was scarce. It's a mainstream historical fact that the diet of the Roman army, often stationed in rural or frontier areas, gives us some insight into practical, portable food. Soldiers received rations of grain, which they had to mill themselves, bacon or salt pork, cheese, salt and posca. They would supplement this with whatever they could forage or purchase locally. Their food needed to be calorie-dense and relatively non-perishable, the ultimate utilitarian diet. One quirky tidbit is the Roman use of cheese spreads, or moretum. Moretum was a rustic paste or spread made from herbs, like garlic, parsley, coriander, rue, cheese, often sheep's or goat's cheese, olive oil and vinegar, all pounded together in a mortar. It was a simple, flavourful, and nutritious accompaniment to bread, and it's something a rural family could easily prepare. Virgil even has a short poem, also titled Moretum, describing a farmer making this for his breakfast. It's like an ancient version of a pesto, or a herbed cream cheese, perfect for a quick, satisfying snack. Our culinary journey has so far focused primarily on the city of Rome itself, and the contrasting simplicity of its immediate rural hinterland. But the Roman Empire was a vast, sprawling entity, stretching from the misty shores of Britannia to the arid deserts of Syria, from the forests of Germania to the fertile Nile Valley in Egypt. This immense territory encompassed a staggering diversity of cultures, climates, and local ingredients. It stands to reason, then, that junk food and local delicacies would have varied significantly across these diverse provinces. What a quick, cheap snack looked like in Roman Britain would likely be quite different from its counterpart in Roman Egypt. Imagine a legionary stationed at Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia. The climate is cooler, damper. Local agriculture would focus on hardier grains like spelt, barley and oats. His fast food options, if not from the military stores, might involve local British specialties adapted with a Roman twist. Perhaps a thick oat cake or a barley bannock, bought from a vendor in a nearby vicus, a civilian settlement that often sprang up around forts. He might find stews made with local game, deer, wild boar, or with mutton from the hardy local sheep. Seafood, like oysters and mussels, was popular in coastal areas of Britain and would have been readily available. One thing he probably wouldn't find easily is olive oil. The climate wasn't suitable for olive cultivation, so it would have been an expensive import used sparingly. Animal fats, like lard or butter, though butter was often viewed by Mediterranean Romans as a bit barbarian, would be more common for cooking. Now contrast this with a merchant in Alexandria, Egypt. The climate is hot and dry, the Nile Delta incredibly fertile. Here, the street food scene would be vibrant and distinctly North African. You'd find an abundance of dates, figs and pomegranates. Bread would likely be made from wheat. perhaps in flatbread form similar to modern pita. Legumes like lentils and chickpeas would be staples, perhaps served as spiced purees or in stews. Fish from the Nile or the Mediterranean would be plentiful. Local Egyptian culinary traditions, which predated Roman rule by millennia, would undoubtedly have influenced the quick bites available. Perhaps vendors sold roasted waterfowl, a common sight along the Nile, or small cakes sweetened with date syrup. The flavours would be different, perhaps with more use of local herbs and spices like cumin and coriander, which thrived in the warmer climate. In the provinces of Gaul, modern-day France, renowned for its agriculture, you might find a different array of street foods. The Gauls were skilled farmers and herders. Pork was particularly popular, and they were known for their cured hams and sausages, traditions that continue to this day. Small meat pies or pasties, using local meats and vegetables, could have been a Gallic street food staple. Cheese production was also well developed in many parts of Gaul, and of course there was wine. While Italy was the heart of Roman viticulture, Gaul also became a major wine-producing region, with its own distinct vintages that might be sold cheaply by local vendors. It's a mainstream historical fact that Gallic pottery, particularly Samian ware, a type of red gloss pottery, was widely exported throughout the Western Empire, often used for tableware, indicating a sophisticated local production and trade network that would also apply to foodstuffs. Travel east to the provinces of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, or Syria, and you'd encounter yet another culinary world. These regions were crossroads of trade and had ancient, sophisticated food cultures. Here, lamb and goat would be common meats. You might find early versions of kebabs, small pieces of marinated meat grilled on skewers sold by street vendors. Flatbreads would be ubiquitous. The use of yogurt, nuts like pistachios and almonds, and fruits like apricots and cherries would be more pronounced. The influence of Persian and Mesopotamian cuisines would be evident in the spicing and preparation methods. Think of dishes rich with herbs, perhaps a hint of sumac or za'atar-like spice blends. One quirky tidbit relates to the selling of mummy. Yes, you read that right. For a time, particularly in later periods and into the medieval era but with roots in ancient beliefs, powdered mummy, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies, was considered a potent medicine for a variety of ailments. While this is more on the fringe of food, though it was ingested, it highlights the sometimes bizarre things people were willing to consume and the opportunities for fraud. Unscrupulous merchants could easily pass off any old ground bones or other dubious substances as genuine, expensive mummy powder. It gives a whole new meaning to mystery meat. So, did the ancient Romans have any form of consumer protection? As mentioned, officials like the aediles had a role in market supervision. They could check weights and measures, false scales were a common complaint, and they might intervene in cases of egregious fraud or the selling of clearly spoiled goods. There were laws against certain types of deception. However, enforcement was likely inconsistent, and the burden of proof often fell on the consumer. Reputation was probably one of the best, albeit imperfect, forms of protection. A vendor known for selling consistently bad or adulterated food would eventually lose customers, at least in a neighbourhood where people had choices and shared information. Word of mouth, "Don't buy wine from Lucius, it's watered-down swill," would have been a powerful, if informal, regulatory mechanism. Historians still argue about the general level of trust and commercial honesty in Roman markets. Some texts paint a picture of rampant cheating and cynicism, while others suggest that, for the most part, commerce functioned on a basis of reasonable faith, especially in established marketplaces where vendors and customers had ongoing relationships. It was likely a mixed bag, with honest dealers and rogues existing side by side, much like today. The difference was the lack of systematic scientific means of detecting adulteration and the limited legal recourse for the average consumer. So as you bite into that piece of Roman street food, there's always that little element of uncertainty. Is this exactly what it appears to be? Is it fresh? Has it been enhanced in some unappetizing way? You're relying on the vendor's honesty, your own senses. Does it look, smell and taste right? And perhaps a bit of luck. It adds a layer of gritty realism to your ancient culinary adventure. Today, we take food safety labels, ingredient lists, and regulatory bodies for granted. For the Roman consumer, it was a far more direct and sometimes far more risky transaction. That delicious morsel might be perfectly fine, or it might be a rotten deal in disguise. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, was indeed the guiding principle. As you continue your exploration of Roman street food, whether in the heart of Rome or in one of its far-flung provinces, a slightly unsettling thought might cross your mind. How could you be sure you were actually getting what you paid for? In a world without stringent food safety regulations, consumer protection agencies, or detailed ingredient labelling, the unfortunate practices of food adulteration and selling rotten or fake food were likely all too common. Buyer beware was very much the order of the day. Imagine you're buying a cup of wine from a street vendor. He assures you it's a decent local vintage, albeit diluted. But how do you know he hasn't diluted it excessively with questionable water, or worse, tried to mask the taste of truly spoiled vinegary wine with honey, spices, or even less savoury additives? Pliny the Elder himself mentions various tricks used by unscrupulous wine merchants, such as adding gypsum, lime, or even resin. Though some resin addition was a legitimate flavouring preservation technique for wines like Retsina, to alter the taste or appearance of inferior wine. You take a sip, and it tastes a bit off. Is it just a bad vintage, or have you been swindled with something doctored? Meat products were also prime candidates for adulteration. That sausage you bought, was it really made from good quality pork, or did it contain a suspiciously high proportion of breadcrumbs, gristle, or even less identifiable fillers? Unscrupulous butchers might try to pass off old meat as fresh, perhaps by washing it with certain solutions or heavily spicing it to disguise any unpleasant odours or tastes. Remember our old friend garum. While it was a flavour enhancer, it could also be a useful tool for masking the taste of ingredients that were past their prime. A vendor with a pot of stew that had been simmering for a little too long might add an extra dash of liquamen and hope for the best. Bread, the staff of life, wasn't immune either. Millers or bakers looking to cut costs might add cheaper substances to their flour, such as ground beans, chalk, or even sawdust, to increase its bulk. This would result in a heavier, less nutritious loaf, but it might not be immediately obvious to the unsuspecting customer, especially if they were buying the coarse, dark bread common among the lower classes. It's a mainstream historical fact that Roman authorities were aware of such practices, and there were officials, like the aediles, who had some oversight over markets and public order, which could include ensuring fair weights and measures and, to some extent, the quality of goods. However, their ability to police every street vendor and every transaction was undoubtedly limited. Olive oil, another Roman staple, could also be adulterated. High-quality olive oil was valuable. Unscrupulous sellers might dilute it with cheaper oils, such as oil from less desirable olives, or even non-olive oils if they could get away with it. They might also try to pass off old, rancid oil as fresh. The taste, colour and aroma could be subtly altered or masked. Honey, the primary sweetener, could be stretched by adding cheaper sugar syrups, like defrutum, made from inferior grapes, or even just water, though the latter would make it prone to fermentation. Spices, especially expensive imported ones like pepper, were notorious targets for adulteration. Ground pepper could be mixed with cheaper ground seeds, berries, or even dust to increase its volume. The further the spice travelled from its source, and the more hands it passed through, the greater the chance of it being tampered with. As our exploration of Roman street food and ancient eating habits nears its end, it's natural to wonder about the legacy of these practices. Did the Roman way of grabbing a quick bite on the go, their thermopolia, their specific dishes and flavour preferences simply vanish with the fall of the Western Empire, or did they leave a lasting imprint on the culinary traditions of Europe and beyond? The answer, like a good Roman stew, is complex and layered, with many ingredients contributing to the final taste. The most direct and visible legacy of Roman convenience food can be seen in the archaeological remains themselves, particularly in cities like Pompeii and Herculaneum. The well-preserved thermopolia in these locations offer a tangible link to ancient daily life, allowing us to walk into a Roman fast food joint and almost imagine the vendor ladling out hot wine or stew. These sites have provided invaluable information to historians and archaeologists, shaping our understanding of Roman urbanism, commerce, and social habits. They are, in a sense, living museums of ancient street food. Beyond the physical remains, certain Roman culinary concepts and even specific dishes appear to have survived or evolved in later European cuisines. The Roman emphasis on bread as a staple, their widespread use of wine, olives, and olive oil, all became foundational elements of Mediterranean diets that persist to this day. While the specific forms might have changed, the core ingredients and their importance endured. Consider the Roman love for sausages, like the lucanica. As we noted, this type of sausage is believed by many to be an ancestor of various Italian luganiga, Spanish longaniza, and Portuguese linguiça. The Roman practice of skilled butchery and charcuterie, preserving and flavouring meats in various forms, was certainly a tradition that continued and flourished in many parts of Europe that were once part of the Roman Empire. Think of the rich sausage-making traditions of Italy, Spain, France, and Germany. While each has its unique characteristics, the underlying Roman appreciation for processed meats is a clear through line. The Roman fondness for flatbreads also finds echoes in many modern European and Middle Eastern breads. While leavened bread became more common, the practicality of simple, quick-to-cook flatbreads, used as an edible utensil or a wrapper for other foods, is a concept that never really disappeared. Think of Italian focaccia, or piadina, Greek pita, or various Middle Eastern flatbreads. Their ancient Roman counterparts would not have been entirely dissimilar. Even that infamous garum, the fermented fish sauce, while it largely fell out of favour in its original Roman form in much of Europe, though some argue that English Worcestershire sauce, with its anchovy base, carries a faint echo, has culinary descendants. Fermented fish sauces remain a vital ingredient in many Southeast Asian cuisines, like Vietnamese nuoc mam or Thai nam plea. While not a direct continuation, it shows that the principle of extracting deep umami flavours from fermented fish is a culinary idea that has resonated across different cultures and time periods. Some artisanal producers in modern Spain and Italy have even attempted to recreate Roman garum based on ancient recipes and archaeological findings, a testament to the enduring fascination with this potent condiment. The concept of the public eating house, the thermopolium or popina, providing ready-made food for those without home cooking facilities or those on the go, also didn't entirely vanish. While the specific form evolved, the idea of taverns, inns and cookshops serving prepared meals to the public continued throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era. The street food vendor selling quick bites from a stall or a cart is a figure who has remained a constant in urban life across millennia. The technology and the specific foods may change, but the fundamental service remains the same. It's a mainstream historical fact that medieval towns and cities also had cookshops and pie sellers catering to travellers and the urban working class, a clear continuation of a Roman model. One quirky tidbit is the survival of certain Roman sweet treats, or at least their descendants. Those globulous, fried dough balls drenched in honey sound remarkably similar to modern fritters or doughnuts found in many cultures. The Roman use of honey and nuts in confectionery also has clear parallels in many traditional European sweets, from nougat to various honey cakes and nut brittle. The basic combination of fried dough, sweetener, and perhaps some spice is a timelessly appealing one. Historians still argue about the precise channels through which Roman culinary traditions were transmitted after the decline of the Western Empire. Some practices likely survived through monastic orders, which preserved Roman agricultural techniques and winemaking. Others continued through this Byzantine Empire in the east, which maintained Roman traditions for much longer. And in regions like Italy and southern Gaul, the Roman way of life, including its food habits, simply evolved organically into medieval and then modern forms, with no definitive break. The barbarian kingdoms that succeeded Rome also adopted and adapted many Roman customs, including aspects of their cuisine. So, while you wouldn't find a thermopolium on a modern European street corner advertising garum-flavoured stew, the spirit of Roman fast food and many of its underlying principles and even some of its flavours are woven into the fabric of Western culinary heritage. The convenience of grabbing a quick meal, the importance of staple ingredients like bread and wine, the ingenuity of preserving and flavouring foods, the social aspect of public eateries, all these have Roman roots. The next time you enjoy a slice of pizza, a descendant of Roman flatbreads, a savoury sausage, or a glass of wine, you are, in a small way, partaking in a tradition that stretches back to the bustling, noisy, and wonderfully diverse food world of ancient Rome. The echoes of those ancient tastes are fainter now, but they are definitely still there if you know how to listen for them. And so, our long winding journey through the streets and alleyways of ancient Rome, a journey filled with the sights, sounds, and most importantly the tastes and smells of its everyday food, begins to draw to a close. You've navigated the crowded thoroughfares, peered into the steaming dolia of the thermopolia, and perhaps even cautiously sampled a sausage laced with that unmistakable tang of garum. You've considered the sweets, the drinks, the challenges of keeping food from spoiling in a world before refrigeration, and why so many Romans relied on these ancient takeaways due to the limitations of their insular homes. You've delved into the often debated reputations of these establishments, contrasting the humble street snack with the lavish banquets of the wealthy elite. You've understood how bread and circuses, the annona, played a crucial role in maintaining social order, and how the vast trade networks of the empire brought exotic flavours to mingle with the local produce, subtly influencing even the simplest fare. We've pondered whether Romans worried about healthy eating through the lens of their humoral theories, and grimaced at the thought of ancient food waste and the ever-present risk of adulterated or rotten deals. You've walked a day in the sandals of an ordinary Roman, piecing together their meals from a quick yentaculum to a street-bought cena. You've journeyed beyond the city walls to compare the urban grub with the simpler, seasonal food of the countryside, and further still across the diverse provinces, realising that a snack in Britannia was a world away from one in Egypt, each with its own local character. And finally, you've considered the faint but persistent echoes of these ancient Roman tastes and food customs in our own culinary world, as the mental image of those bustling Roman streets begins to soften, the sharp edges of the cobblestones blurring slightly, the cacophony of vendors' cries and rumbling carts fading into a more distant murmur. You might find yourself reflecting on the sheer, vibrant humanity of it all. These weren't just abstract historical figures. They were people, much like us, driven by the same fundamental needs and desires. The need for sustenance, for a moment of pleasure, for social connection, all played out daily in the food stalls and cookshops of their world. The concerns they faced, the cost of food, its quality, its safety, the effort of preparing it, are timeless. Their solutions were ingenious, born of necessity and the resources available to them. The smoky aroma of grilling meat, the sweet scent of honey cakes, the sharp tang of cheap wine, the ever-present salty depth of fish sauce, these were the everyday sensory experiences that grounded them in their time and place. There's a certain comfort in recognising these shared human experiences across the vast gulf of centuries. That Roman labourer, eagerly anticipating his midday stew, felt a hunger as real as any you've ever known. The child delighting in a sticky globulus experienced a joy as pure as any modern child with a doughnut. The world of Roman street food was a world of immediate sensations, of robust flavours, of quick transactions and fleeting interactions. It was perhaps a less refined world than that of the frescoed triclinia, but it was undeniably more alive, more democratic, more reflective of the daily pulse of a vast and complex society. It was the fuel that kept the heart of the empire beating, one humble, often uncelebrated meal at a time, and as you let these images and sensations recede, feeling the gentle pull of your own time and place, perhaps carry with you a newfound appreciation for the long, intricate history that lies behind even the simplest food on your own table. The journey of flavours, of customs, of how we feed ourselves, is a story that continues to unfold, a story in which we are all participants. The echoes of ancient Rome are there, if you listen closely, a quiet reminder of the enduring human quest for a good meal, quickly and easily obtained. The light from the flickering oil lamps of the Roman thermopolium seems to dim now, the once sharp aromas of roasting meats and fermenting sauces softening into a gentle memory. The clamour of the ancient city, with its countless footsteps on stone and the persistent calls of vendors, recedes into a soft, distant hum, much like the fan you might have whirring quietly in your room. Feel the weight of your day, your own modern concerns begin to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of this shared journey into a time long past. There are no more cobblestones to navigate, no more dubious sausages to inspect, only the comfortable stillness of your own space. The vibrant, sometimes gritty reality of Roman street life fades into the gentler, more forgiving landscape of dreams. Let the knowledge that these ancient people, with their own daily struggles and simple pleasures, found comfort and sustenance in their everyday fare, bring a sense of peace. Their world, for all its differences, was still a human world, and their need for a satisfying meal at the end of a long day is something we can all understand. As you drift now, let the last vestiges of Roman spice and wine give way to the quietude of approaching sleep, feeling a connection to those distant lives, now just peaceful echoes in the corridors of history. Rest well.